In the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the line between what is seen and what is hidden has always been fragile. As the sun sinks and the last rays of light bleed into the horizon, the desert takes on another nature. The stillness grows heavier. The air cools, yet it carries a hum, a tension that is not easily explained. In that twilight silence, travelers have long believed they are not alone. The dunes, vast and empty in the daylight, become crowded with presences that cannot be measured in footsteps or voices. The desert night is alive with watchful eyes. For the Bedouin tribes who moved across these vast landscapes, this sense of being observed was not dismissed as paranoia or imagination. It was memory, inherited across generations, reinforced by countless encounters and stories. The desert was not empty, and the night was not silent. This was the time of the jinn, beings said to dwell in the very spaces where human presence falters. To set camp in the wrong place, to wander alone at dusk, to call out a name when no one should answer, these were invitations, and not always the kind one survives. The desert lends itself to this belief because it is, in many ways, already otherworldly. Shifting dunes can appear like walls that move in the distance. The wind sings through narrow canyons, sounding almost like a whisper or a moan. Mirage waters shimmer and vanish, tricking the eye into chasing what is not there. For people who live their lives depending on the mercy of these landscapes, the idea that other beings, hidden, capricious, dangerous, lived within it was not a matter of fantasy. It was a recognition of something deeper. The desert gave life and took it with equal ease. So too did the jinn. The earliest mentions of them in Arabian memory place them in exactly this kind of space, marginal, unstable, beyond the comfort of village walls. Ancient poets who composed verses long before the rise of Islam often described their inspiration as coming from jinn. The gift of eloquence, the sharpness of a tongue that could cut an enemy with words, was thought to be whispered into their ears by these unseen companions. Every poet, it was said, had a familiar spirit, a jinni who guided him, sometimes even possessed him. Poetry, the highest art of pre-Islamic Arabia, was born of a dialogue between men and spirits. But the relationship was never safe. Inspiration might just as easily become madness. A poet could claim his brilliance came from his jinni companion, but if his words turned strange, or if he was overcome by fits of shouting, babbling, or wandering, people would whisper that the jinn had seized him completely. Madness and genius were two sides of the same coin, and both could be traced to the same hidden source. The desert was a realm where this ambiguity thrived. It was not only poets who encountered the jinn. Traders who journeyed across the Red Sea routes spoke of strange voices echoing among the cliffs, voices that called them by name, though no one was there. Shepherds alone at night among their flocks swore they heard footsteps approaching, felt breath on the back of their necks, only to turn and see nothing. Entire tribes told of wells guarded by spirits, places where water could not be drawn without offering a few drops of milk, or a whispered prayer for permission. The belief was not in rare miracles, but in daily negotiations. To live in this land meant living alongside other beings who claimed their share of it. The Quran would later describe the jinn as a separate creation of God, fashioned from smokeless fire. But long before scripture fixed their nature into sacred text, people already believed in their fiery essence. Fire was the only thing that seemed to explain their speed, their invisibility, their capacity to flare into violence and then vanish into silence. Fire was both life-giving and destructive. It was the hearth and the desert blaze, the cook fire and the consuming inferno. To To imagine a creature born entirely of it was to accept that such beings could never be fully trusted. They might illuminate for a moment, but they would burn just as easily. Even their name carried power. To say jinn was not always done lightly. Some preferred to avoid naming them directly, using euphemisms instead, hoping to deflect attention. For to name a being is to risk drawing it near, and one never wanted to invite the wrong listener. The same word root gives rise to meanings of concealment and hiddenness. The jinn were not only creatures, they were defined by their secrecy. They existed in the shadows of human knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, in the gaps of human certainty. Night in the desert amplified these feelings. To the people who lived it, night was not merely a cycle of time, it was an opening. Darkness expanded the world in terrifying ways. Distances could not be measured, shapes bent into other shapes. The known collapsed into the unknown, and within that unknown, stories circulated of travelers who vanished, of children lured away by voices, of entire caravans encountering lights in the distance, only to discover they had been led astray into the deepest wastelands. These were not dismissed as chance misfortunes. They were attributed to the mischief of the jinn. What made the jinn so unsettling was not simply their existence, but their unpredictability. They were neither wholly benevolent nor wholly malevolent. One encounter might bring ruin, another unexpected assistance. Some stories told of men collapsing from exhaustion in the desert, only to wake and find themselves carried to water, saved by a spirit who vanished before thanks could be given. Others told of tents torn apart in the night, animals slaughtered, children struck ill, all without human culprit. The jinn did not follow human morality. They acted on their own laws, which were only dimly understood. The desert therefore became a theatre of cautionary practices. When lighting a fire, one might whisper a prayer, asking that no hidden being be offended by its presence. When pouring hot water onto the ground, one would call out a warning, lest the water scald a jinn unseen. When entering an abandoned ruin, one might knock 3 times and recite words of respect, acknowledging that others might already dwell there. To ignore these customs was to invite retaliation. The world was crowded, even when it looked empty. The timing of encounters mattered too. Just as twilight opened the threshold, so did certain hours of night. The hour just before dawn was particularly feared, for it was believed the jinn grew restless then, moving between their domains and seeking out the careless. Travelers often delayed setting out until the sun had risen, unwilling to risk those uncertain moments when the balance of night and day was still unsettled. Mothers warned their children not to wander alone after sunset, not because of thieves or predators, but because of what could not be seen. The most chilling stories spoke of voices calling from the darkness. Sometimes it was a voice known to the listener, a brother, a friend, even a parent. But to follow it was to walk into danger. The jinn were said to be master mimics, capable of reproducing any sound, any human tone, to lure the unwary away from the safety of camp. This power of imitation made them especially feared. If one could not trust the evidence of their ears, then the very senses became unreliable. It was a destabilization of reality itself. In time, these stories became woven into the identity of the people. To speak of the desert was to speak of its spirits. They were not confined to folk tales told in leisure. They were warnings carried in daily life. A child misbehaving at night might be told that the jinn would hear and come. A lone traveller who failed to return was not simply unfortunate but taken. Even illness could be explained by their influence, possession, or the touch of a hidden being that slipped into the body unseen. The human body, like the desert, was a frontier they could cross, And yet, despite this fear, the jinn were not outsiders in the imagination. They were part of the same world. They married, bore children, built communities in ruins and caves. They listened to music. They quarreled. They worshipped or rejected worship. They were like men, yet unlike men. Parallel, but untouchable. This parallel existence is what made them endure so powerfully in belief. To think of them was to think of another society running alongside one's own, invisible but perpetually intersecting. The desert tribes, aware of this, developed a sense that every interaction carried weight beyond the visible. Hospitality, respect, restraint. These were not only human virtues, but protections against the unseen. To be arrogant or careless in the wilderness was to invite disaster, not just from the harshness of nature, but from the unpredictable will of the jinn. Survival depended not only on water and shelter, but on deference to those who also claimed the desert as home. As the centuries moved forward, as towns grew and trade routes expanded, the jinn remained deeply embedded in thought. They were not relics of a primitive past, but continued presences, adaptable to changing times. A merchant might swear that a failed venture was the work of a jealous jinni. A family might avoid a particular grove because of strange noises said to come from it at night. Even as knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and philosophy advanced, the jinn were not erased. They lingered in the margins, in the places unexplained. This is why dusk in the desert still carries a weight. To stand at the edge of the fading light is to stand where countless generations have stood before, aware of the shift, aware that the seen gives way to the unseen. It is the threshold where human certainty dissolves into something older, less forgiving, and far less knowable. For the people who lived in this land, the jinn were never distant myths. They were neighbors, rivals, companions, and threats. The desert at dusk was their introduction, the first moment when silence became crowded, when the ordinary world was joined by another. The jinn are described as being made of smokeless fire, and this detail is central to understanding their nature. Fire without smoke is not the fire of the hearth or the camp, not the flame that cooks food or warms the body. It is purer, harder to grasp, and closer to lightning, a flash of energy that destroys before one can even process its arrival. The desert people knew fire in all its forms, from the fragile glow of oil lamps to the merciless blaze of the sun, and so to imagine a creature whose very substance was this element stripped of weight or residue was to imagine something dangerously uncontainable. This idea was given permanence in the words of the Quran, where God declares that mankind was created from clay and the jinn from smokeless fire. Clay is earth, heavy, shaped, tied to the soil. Fire is restless, shifting, incapable of stillness. The distinction defines the relationship between the two creations. Humans are grounded, tied to cycles of growth, labor, and mortality. The jinn are volatile, elusive, creatures of sudden passion and quick destruction. From the very beginning, they were set apart, fashioned from a different essence, one that made them both more free and more unstable than humanity. Stories about their earliest moments diverge. Some traditions describe a time before Adam, when the jinn roamed the earth as the dominant beings. They were many, they built their own societies, and they spread across the lands with a freedom unknown to mortals. But their fireborn nature carried with it a tendency toward excess. They quarreled, waged war, and their arrogance grew so great that their rule was cut short. According to some versions, angels descended to drive them back, casting them into deserts, oceans, and ruins, banishing them from the centers of creation. In this telling, their relationship with humanity is marked by resentment, for they see in us the new chosen creatures, the ones who replace them. The figure of Iblis embodies this history. Among the jinn, he was said to be one of the most devoted worshippers of God, elevated to stand among the angels themselves. But when Adam was created from clay and commanded to be honored, Iblis refused. He looked upon himself and saw superiority. Fire, he declared, was nobler than clay. How could he bow to something made of mud? His arrogance condemned him, and his defiance became the moment of his fall. From that moment onward, he was the adversary, sworn to mislead humanity until the final judgment. His story shaped the way the jinn were seen, as creatures of fire, quick to pride, resistant to humility, forever caught between obedience and rebellion. The smokeless fire of their origin explains their abilities. Fire consumes but leaves little trace. It spreads quickly, slips through cracks, leaps from one place to another. So too do the jinn move unseen, enter spaces without obstruction, cross vast distances in an instant. Fire can also illuminate, and there are tales of jinn who revealed secrets, whispered knowledge of hidden things, taught spells or cures to those who sought their help. But fire can burn as easily as it lights, and just as a single spark can bring ruin to an entire encampment, a single jinn could devastate a life if offended or provoked. To call them fireborn was also to acknowledge their restless energy. Humans tire, age, and wither, but the jinn were said to live for centuries, perhaps even millennia. Their fire did not go out easily. Some believed that they aged differently, growing in wisdom or in malice, depending on their choices, but always enduring far beyond human lifespans. The fire within them gave them continuity, a kind of immortality that made them seem both enviable and frightening. To meet a jinn was to encounter something old, perhaps older than cities, older than memory, carrying with it a history beyond comprehension. There was another implication to being born of smokeless fire. Fire has no stable form. It flickers, dances, changes shape from instant to instant. This was reflected in the jinn's capacity for transformation. They could appear as animals, as shadows, as people indistinguishable from the real thing. They were not bound by a single body in the way humans were. Just as flame can take the shape of its fuel, so could they adopt whatever guise suited their purpose. This ability made them masters of deception, but also wanderers without fixed identity. To know one was to never be certain if what you saw was true. In the old traditions, the jinn's creation was not just a theological statement, but a way of explaining the unexplainable. Why did a man suddenly lose his senses and wander the desert babbling? The fireborn spirit had seized him, inflaming his mind. Why did a healthy child fall ill overnight? The fire had touched the body. Why did caravans vanish or storms sweep across the dunes without warning? The jinn were restless, their essence stirring the world into chaos. Fire was both a literal and symbolic explanation, a way of naming the unpredictability that surrounded human life. The fire also gave them a link to certain places: volcanic mountains, fissures in the earth where smoke and heat poured out, were seen as their homes. Hot winds that swept across the desert were thought to carry their breath. Even the flicker of desert lightning was attributed to their movement. The natural world itself seemed to testify to their presence. Whenever fire appeared without human cause, the assumption was that the jinn were near. To live in their world was to constantly read the signs, to watch for fire in places where it should not be, to hear the wind and wonder whose voice carried on it. The Quran describes the creation of jinn alongside that of humanity, affirming their existence not as myth, but as parallel reality. They are described as nations like us, divided between those who believe and those who reject faith. They pray, marry, fight, and die, just as humans do, but their fire-born essence sets them apart. They are unseen unless they choose to appear. They move with a swiftness we cannot match, and they hear what is spoken in solitude. For believers, this meant that human life was never private. In the silence of night, unseen listeners could be present, drawn by the very words we speak. The story of their origin also carried moral lessons. Fire, in its purity, is both beautiful and destructive. It symbolizes passion, brilliance, but also pride and rebellion. To remember that the jinn were made of fire was to remember that unchecked pride leads to downfall, as it did for Iblis. Humanity, made of clay, might seem lowly, but clay is enduring, fertile, capable of being shaped into countless forms. The contrast between clay and fire was a teaching in humility. The fragile substance may outlast the volatile flame. Still, the allure of fire could not be denied. People feared the jinn, but also sought them out. Sorcerers and seekers of hidden knowledge were said to make pacts with them, hoping to gain some share of their fiery power. To do so was dangerous, for fire consumes as easily as it grants warmth, but the temptation remained. The origin of the jinn as creatures of smokeless fire meant they were both warnings and promises, sources of fear and fascination. Over time, as Islam spread and redefined older traditions, the description of the jinn's fiery essence became fixed. It was not simply folklore, but revelation. Yet the older echoes remained. In the stories of tribes who remembered battles with jinn armies, in the tales of wells and caves haunted by their presence, in the whispered belief that some families carried jinn blood through marriages of the distant past. The fire-born nature of these beings continued to shape how people interpreted every strange noise in the night, every sudden misfortune, every unexplained gift of words or visions. The desert still reflects this duality. In the day, it is blinding, oppressive, consuming in its heat. At night, it is cold, silent, empty. Fire bridges these extremes. It is the torch that keeps away the dark, the blaze that signals life across miles of emptiness. And yet, uncontrolled, it is the very element that can destroy everything built with patience and care. To imagine creatures born entirely of this essence was to imagine neighbors who were never at rest, never fully safe, and never far from the edges of human life. And so the origin of the jinn was never just a story about what they were made of. It was a statement about how humans understood the world, as a place where visible and invisible forces intermingled, where the elements themselves gave rise to companions and adversaries, where every fire carried a reminder of other beings who moved unseen. To know that the jinn were born of smokeless fire was to recognize that the unseen world was not separate from the seen, but intertwined, flickering just beyond perception, always present in the glow that lingered after the flame. If the jinn were truly distant, inhabiting only remote mountains or deep caverns, it might have been easier to ignore them. But the weight of belief always rested on the idea that they didn't live far away, nor only in unseen realms, but in the very same spaces as humans. They were hidden folk, existing alongside mankind in overlapping worlds, sometimes so near that the boundary between our lives and theirs seemed to vanish entirely. This closeness made them part of daily existence, not just figures of legend. The desert was vast and cruel, but people were not alone in it. Every ruin carried whispers of habitation, not only of the ancestors who once built it, but of the spirits who lingered there afterward. Travelers were warned not to rest in abandoned houses without permission. Even empty fields at night were considered suspect, for jinn were thought to gather in open places once the sun had set. The hidden folk had no need of human doors or walls. They could pass through unseen, claiming space where mortals believed there was none. Villagers spoke of wells and springs watched by jinn. Water, the most precious element of desert life, was never entirely free of danger. There were tales of people who approached a spring without speaking words of respect and fell ill, struck by unseen retaliation. It was common to pour a few drops of water back into the well after drawing it, an offering to the spirits who guarded it. In this way, every act of survival, drinking, bathing, washing, was also a quiet negotiation with unseen neighbors. Stories of shared habitation extended even into homes. The belief in house spirits, small presences that lived alongside families, blurred into the wider world of the jinn. A sudden chill in the air, the sound of movement in a quiet room, the disappearance of small objects. These were interpreted as signs that the hidden folk were close. To live in a house was to accept that others might live there too, invisible but attentive, watching human behavior, sensitive to insult, and capable of retaliation. The jinn's closeness was reinforced by the idea that they, like humans, formed communities. They married, raised children, worked, and even worshipped. To think of them this way was to strip away the comfort of distance. They were not vague phantoms, but parallel beings. A family might live in a village, unaware that another, unseen family of jinn occupied the same space. This belief explained the sudden misfortunes that fell upon households. An illness, an accident, or a string of bad luck could be understood as a conflict between neighbors. Unseen neighbors whose rights had been violated or whose space had been trespassed. Even the wilderness was not truly empty. A lonely traveler who chose to camp in a cave might wake to find himself surrounded by presences, not animals, but spirits who claimed the cave as their home. Old ruins especially carried this association. Long after a tribe had abandoned its dwellings, stories told of the jinn who had moved in, adopting the crumbling walls as their own domain. Approaching such ruins at night was discouraged. If entry was necessary, one was expected to announce themselves respectfully, asking permission from the hidden occupants before stepping inside. The overlap between human and jinn life extended into moments of weakness. Sleep was one of the most vulnerable states. It was believed that jinn could enter dreams, sometimes to frighten, sometimes to seduce, and sometimes to impart strange knowledge. People who woke with nightmares or feelings of suffocation often attributed it to a spirit pressing upon them during the night. A sickness that followed might be interpreted as a possession, the jinn lingering in the body after such an encounter. Healers and wise men developed prayers and rituals to drive them out, treating the human body as contested ground between visible flesh and invisible fire. Because of this perceived closeness, daily behavior was filled with small acts of caution. People avoided whistling at night, fearing it would call the jinn. Spilling hot water was preceded by a warning in case a spirit lingered unseen. Entering lonely places required a prayer of protection. These customs were not marginal superstitions, but core habits of life. They reflected the understanding that humans were never truly alone, that every action might ripple into the unseen and provoke a response from the hidden folk who shared the world. There were stories of marriages between humans and jinn, unions that blurred the boundary between the two races. A man might encounter a beautiful woman in the desert, only to discover later she was no ordinary mortal, but a jinnia in disguise. Such tales often ended in tragedy, with the human unable to endure the strangeness of his spouse, or with the jinn wife vanishing suddenly, returning to her own kind. Yet these stories also reinforce the idea that intimacy between the two worlds was possible, that the hidden folk were not always distant, but capable of entangling themselves deeply in human lives. Children born of such unions were said to inherit unusual qualities, uncommon beauty, extraordinary talent, or uncanny behavior that set them apart. Whether these were real or imagined, the belief persisted that some families carried within them a trace of the jinn. This notion blurred the line further, suggesting that the hidden folk were not simply neighbors, but potential kin, bound by ties of blood as well as fear. The idea of living side by side also explained the diversity of human experience. Where one man might encounter generosity, another found cruelty. Just as humans varied in their character, so did the jinn. Some were described as faithful, even pious, practicing prayer and obedience. Others were malicious, delighting in harm. This spectrum made them mirror images of humanity, a reminder that the unseen world was not simpler or more uniform than the visible one. To live alongside the jinn was to live alongside a society as complicated and unpredictable as one's own. The Quran reinforced this closeness by addressing both humans and jinn together, reminding believers that both were responsible for their choices and would be judged. Entire passages describe jinn who listened to the recitation and accepted its truth, forming communities of believers. This recognition lifted them out of the realm of distant myth and placed them directly into the moral fabric of existence. They were not only hidden neighbors, but fellow creatures bound by the same divine law, subject to the same accountability. Still, for ordinary people, this nearness brought as much fear as it did familiarity. To accept that the jinn lived side by side was to accept constant vulnerability. Any misstep might offend them. Any carelessness might attract them. A sick child, a failed crop, a sudden quarrel between family members, all could be traced to their interference. This gave meaning to suffering, but it also ensured that fear lingered in every corner. The hidden folk explained the unexplained, but in doing so, they made the world more dangerous. This closeness shaped the role of religious specialists, the healer, the reciter of protective verses, the one who could distinguish a natural illness from a jinn affliction, became essential figures in communities. They mediated between the seen and unseen, offering protection, diagnosis, and sometimes negotiation. Stories circulated of men who could see the jinn, who could speak with them directly, who could command them to leave a house or lift a curse. These figures were both respected and feared, for to interact with the hidden folk was to risk becoming tainted by them. Encounters with the jinn were not always hostile. There were tales of spirits who aided travelers, leading them to water or shelter in times of need. Some were believed to protect entire tribes, acting as guardians in exchange for respect and offerings. In this way, the hidden folk could be allies as well as threats. Their closeness meant that they were woven into the survival of communities, not merely lurking in the shadows, but sometimes guiding or protecting those who honored them. Over generations, this coexistence became a defining feature of Arabian identity. To speak of life was to speak of it in two layers, the visible and the hidden. Every action had consequences in both. This dual awareness shaped customs, law, and even imagination. It is why the desert night, the ruined village, the lonely road, all became more than physical spaces. They were meeting points where humans and jinn overlapped, where caution and respect were not luxuries but necessities. This sense of constant proximity ensured that the jinn remained central to daily life, not as distant myths, but as ever-present companions. They were hidden, but never absent. Their closeness was not always welcome, but it was always acknowledged. And in acknowledging them, people recognized that the world they inhabited was more crowded, more complex, and more fragile than sight alone could ever reveal. When people spoke of the jinn, they did not imagine them only as distant spirits haunting the fringes of the world. They described them as beings who stepped directly into human affairs, shaping events in ways both mischievous and instructive. This dual role, trickster and teacher, made them both feared and strangely respected. The jinn could ruin a man's fortune with a whisper, but they could also hand him the very knowledge that allowed him to survive. To live in a world shared with them meant recognizing that lessons often came disguised as trials, and that wisdom might be found in places marked first by terror. In countless stories told across the Arabian world, the jinn appear not as grand, terrifying forces, but as tricksters, testing the alertness of men and women. A traveler might hear his name carried across the desert wind. Instinctively, he might turn and follow, only to find himself wandering in circles, led astray until exhaustion overtakes him. The voice, when it revealed itself, belonged not to a friend, but to a jinni who delighted in misdirection. Others told of jinn who appeared as wandering merchants, offering wares at suspiciously low prices. The unfortunate buyer would discover later that the goods crumbled into sand or turned into useless scraps of cloth. These pranks were not harmless amusements, but lessons in caution, reminders that not everything in life was what it seemed. The jinn's reputation as deceivers extended into the realm of dreams. A man might be visited in his sleep by a figure who offered secrets or promises of wealth. But when he woke and followed the instructions, he often found only disappointment, or worse, danger. People learned to treat such dreams with suspicion, never rushing blindly into what seemed like miraculous opportunities. The jinn in these stories were tricksters in the purest sense, creatures who thrived on exploiting human greed, impatience, and arrogance. To be deceived was to expose one's flaws. To resist the deception was to grow wiser. Yet these same beings were also described as teachers. The difference lay not in their nature, but in the way humans responded to them. A poet who felt the presence of a jinni at his side did not treat it as a curse. He listened, let the words pour into his mind, and turned them into verses that could outlive generations. The very same power that might drive another man to madness became for him a source of brilliance. The line between torment and gift was thin, and the jinn were often the ones holding it. There were tales of healers who claimed their knowledge of herbs came from encounters with spirits. Lost in the wilderness, they said, a jinni appeared and pointed to the plants that cured fevers or soothed wounds. Whether these claims were literal or symbolic, the association between jinn and secret knowledge persisted. They were not simply beings of chaos, but custodians of information hidden from ordinary human eyes. To seek their help was dangerous, but to deny that they possessed wisdom was impossible. The Quran itself acknowledges this complexity. It records that groups of jinn listened to its recitation and recognized its truth. They returned to their communities and warned them, urging them to heed the message. This image of the jinn as capable of understanding, believing, and even teaching others placed them firmly in the moral landscape. They were not mindless demons, but beings capable of grasping divine guidance and passing it on. If some misled, others corrected. If some tempted, others warned. Their role was never uniform. Folk traditions carried this duality into the rhythm of daily life. A sudden misfortune might be blamed on a mischievous jinn, but a sudden stroke of insight or skill could just as easily be attributed to one who offered a gift. Musicians, like poets, were sometimes believed to play with the aid of unseen companions, their hands moving with a speed and grace beyond ordinary training. Even craftsmen were said to benefit from jinn influence, producing works so fine it seemed impossible without hidden help. These beliefs did not diminish human skill, but acknowledged that talent was often touched by forces beyond the visible. The jinn as tricksters also served as guardians of boundaries. People told of children who wandered too far from camp and were lured by lights dancing in the distance. Only later did they realize they had been led to the very edge of a cliff or deep into a ravine. The jinn in these stories punished carelessness, turning curiosity into danger. Parents used such tales as warnings, teaching children to respect limits and avoid reckless wandering. The trickster role was cruel, but it carried within it a lesson. The world was not safe for the careless, and respect for unseen boundaries was essential. Not all lessons came in such frightening forms. Some jinn were said to reward kindness. A traveller who shared his food or water with a stranger, even one who appeared suspicious, might later discover that the stranger was no man at all but a jinni in disguise. The reward might be protection on the journey, unexpected success in trade, or the simple survival of a storm. These stories encouraged generosity, not because it guaranteed safety, but because one never knew who might be watching. A selfish act could invite mockery or punishment, while generosity might win allies from the unseen world. The reputation of the jinn as both deceivers and teachers also shaped how people approached the idea of magic. Sorcerers who sought to command jinn were viewed with suspicion, for their bargains were thought to be unstable. The jinn might offer power, but they rarely gave it freely. The one who sought their help had to pay a price, sometimes in rituals, sometimes in loyalty, sometimes in the slow corruption of their soul. These pacts were dangerous precisely because the jinn were tricksters. A sorcerer might believe he was in control, but the spirit could twist the bargain at any moment, turning the seeker into the victim. And yet, many believed that without the knowledge of the jinn, true mastery of hidden arts was impossible. They were teachers of secrets no human could uncover alone. This ambiguity kept the jinn alive in the imagination. They were not confined to the role of enemy. They were not holy allies either. They were unpredictable, like fire itself, capable of warmth or destruction, depending on how one approached them. This made them endlessly relevant to human life. Every choice, every encounter could be framed as a test, a trick designed to reveal character, or a gift meant to guide one forward. To live among the jinn was to live with constant opportunities for both failure and growth. The everyday presence of the jinn also blurred into matters of morality. Whispered temptations, sudden impulses to act against one's better judgment, were often attributed to their influence. But resistance to these whispers was framed as a kind of moral training. To blame the jinn entirely was to excuse weakness. To recognize their role while still choosing rightly was to grow stronger. In this way, even their mischief became part of a larger pattern of teaching, shaping human responsibility through struggle. Generations grew up hearing these stories not as distant myths, but as explanations for daily challenges. a merchant's sudden ruin, a poet's unexpected brilliance, a child's brush with danger, all could be linked to the hidden folk. The jinn were never absent from human life. They were the shadows that mocked, the voices that warned, the sudden insight that saved, the companion at the edge of vision. Tricksters and teachers, they shaped the imagination of entire cultures, ensuring that no moment of human existence was ever entirely free from their presence. Among all the roles attributed to the jinn, one of the most enduring is that of the whisperer. This is not the image of the trickster who plays visible pranks, nor the teacher who grants wisdom in secret. The whisperer is far more subtle, far more insidious. It is the jinn as an intimate presence, a voice that does not come from outside, but seems to stir within the very thoughts of a person. This role tied them directly to the experience of temptation, the invisible tug that draws a human being toward choices they know they should resist. The Quran itself names this aspect clearly. In the final chapter, the prayer seeks refuge from the whisperer who withdraws, the one who whispers into the hearts of mankind, from among jinn and men. This recognition gave shape to what countless people already believed. The jinn were not only external beings, haunting lonely places. They were internal voices, unseen companions who exploited weakness by suggestion rather than force. To imagine a whisperer was to imagine that temptation was never just human, but part of a larger battle for influence over the soul. Stories of whispering jinn took many forms. A man on the verge of making a business deal might feel a sudden surge of greed, a push to cheat or lie. Later, when misfortune followed, he would say it was the whisper of a jinn that nudged him into dishonesty. A woman in prayer might find her concentration broken by intrusive thoughts, dark and distracting, and she too would blame a jinn whisperer. These were not excuses meant to erase responsibility, but explanations that made sense of the uncanny power of temptation, the way it seemed to arrive unbidden, as if planted from elsewhere. The power of whispering lay in its invisibility. A jinn did not need to appear in monstrous form or announce itself with terror. It simply needed to bend thought ever so slightly, to shift desire, to cloud judgment. This subtlety made them far more dangerous than open enemies. One could prepare against a thief or a wild beast, but how could one guard against a thought that seemed like one's own? The whisperer blurred the line between external influence and internal weakness, creating a space where people questioned the origin of their very impulses. This connection between jinn and temptation deepened with the story of Iblis. His refusal to bow to Adam was not simply pride, but the seed of a larger rebellion. Condemned, he swore to mislead humanity, to come upon them from before and behind, from their right and their left, to tempt them away from gratitude and obedience. His defiance turned into a mission, and his followers among the jinn became the embodiment of this role. To describe temptation was to describe the work of Iblis and his allies, whisperers who never cease their efforts. Yet the whisperer was not always framed as entirely external. Many believed that every person was assigned a companion spirit at birth, a Qaran, a jinn who shadowed them throughout their life. This companion was thought to whisper constantly, urging towards sin, exploiting fear, and magnifying desire. The idea made temptation deeply personal. It was not only a general force in the world, but a presence bound to each individual, always near, always watching, always ready to speak at the weakest moment. The struggle of life became inseparable from the struggle with this companion's whispers. Religious practice was shaped by this understanding. Prayer, remembrance, recitation of sacred words. All were seen as defenses against whispers. The tongue became the shield, words of remembrance, silencing the murmurs of unseen voices. People were taught to seek protection before entering places of vulnerability, before sleeping, before beginning important tasks. These acts were not empty rituals, but strategies to resist the unseen dialogue always pressing against their minds. To ignore them was to leave oneself open to influence. In folk tales, whisperers often appeared at moments of crisis. A warrior might be tempted to flee the battlefield by a voice that magnified his fear. A merchant might be persuaded to hoard rather than share. A mother might be tormented by doubts about her child's safety, driven to paranoia. In each case, the whisper was subtle enough to feel like an inner thought, but persistent enough to wear down resistance. These tales reinforced the lesson that vigilance was not only physical but mental, that the greatest battles were fought in silence within the heart. At the same time, the presence of whispering jinn gave people a way to explain the contradictions of human behavior. Why did a man known for generosity suddenly act with cruelty? Why did a woman of strong faith falter in a moment of weakness? It was not that they were entirely corrupted, but that a whisper found its way into their hearts at just the wrong moment. This perspective allowed for compassion as well as caution. People were seen as vulnerable, engaged in a struggle larger than themselves, and thus in need of support and forgiveness. The whisperers also embodied the danger of doubt. Faith was not only attacked through desire, but through uncertainty. A whisper might not tell someone to commit an obvious sin. It might simply ask, "Is this really true? Is this really worth following?" Doubt, once planted, could grow like fire smouldering beneath the surface. The jinn as whisperers were thus seen as sowers of confusion, not only luring people into visible misdeeds, but eroding the very foundations of conviction. To resist them required not only moral strength, but clarity of belief. This role also revealed something profound about how people understood themselves. The human mind was not imagined as a sealed chamber, but as a contested space, open to influence from beyond. To guard one's thoughts was as important as guarding one's body. This understanding gave rise to constant vigilance, an awareness that every choice was subject to unseen pressures. People spoke less about defeating the jinn outright, and more about resisting, enduring, maintaining faith despite their presence. The whisperer was not easily destroyed. It was endured, recognized, and countered with discipline. At the same time, the figure of the whispering jinn reflected a deeper truth about temptation itself. The voice never commanded directly. It only suggested, encouraged, nudged. The choice remained with the human being. This preserved the sense of responsibility while acknowledging the reality of external pressure. To blame the jinn entirely was to deny one's own agency. To ignore them entirely was to underestimate the struggle. The balance lay in admitting both. The whispers existed, but so did the capacity to resist them. Communities reinforced this balance through storytelling. Children were warned of whisperers, so they would recognize temptation early. Adults reminded each other of prayers and rituals to keep the voices at bay. Entire traditions of wisdom grew out of the idea that vigilance of thought was as crucial as vigilance of action. The jinn as whisperers thus became more than frightening figures. They were teachers of resilience, forcing people to cultivate strength against unseen pressure, to sharpen their awareness of the difference between impulse and conviction. In this way, the whisperer became one of the most intimate roles of the jinn. Unlike the trickster encountered on a lonely road or the teacher who revealed secrets in the wilderness, the whisperer lived within reach of every human heart. No one could claim to be free of them. To acknowledge their presence was to acknowledge the constant struggle of life itself, the tension between desire and discipline, doubt and faith, fear and courage. The jinn did not only inhabit deserts and ruins, they inhabited the very spaces of thought, reminding people that the unseen world was never far away. When people spoke of the powers of the jinn, few qualities were described with more fascination and fear than their ability to change form. To say that they were shapeshifters was not only to suggest they could hide their true nature, but that they were masters of illusion itself, bending reality until nothing could be trusted. They could appear as men, women, animals, or shadows, taking whatever guise suited their purpose. This made them dangerous in ways no sword or wall could protect against. For how could one guard against an enemy who might appear as a friend, a lover, or even a reflection of oneself? The desert lent itself to such tales. At night, the shapes of dunes shifted constantly, their edges blurring in the moonlight, until the eye could not be certain what it saw. A rock at a distance could look like a crouched figure. The flicker of firelight turned shadows into moving forms. These natural illusions gave credibility to stories of spirits who could turn such confusion into deliberate trickery. If the land itself could deceive, how much more could beings born of smokeless fire? One of the most common tales told of jinn who took the shape of animals. Black dogs were especially feared, not merely as strays, but as possible disguises. A lone traveller encountering one on the road at night might hesitate, unsure if he faced an ordinary creature or a jinni watching him. Snakes carried the same reputation. Many families in Arabia and beyond developed customs never to kill a snake found inside the home without first offering words of warning, for it might not be a snake at all, but a jinn taking its form. If it lingered after being warned 3 times, only then could it be harmed. The practice was not only superstition, but an acknowledgement that the hidden folk could blur the line between animal and spirit. Stories of jinn as cats also circulated widely. Black cats in particular were treated with suspicion, believed to be favourite disguises of wandering spirits. Children were warned not to torment them, not because of ordinary cruelty, but because one never knew what vengeance might follow. In this way, the shape-shifting ability of the jinn shaped even the simplest interactions with animals, adding layers of caution to daily life. Every encounter might carry more weight than it seemed. But the jinn did not only appear as animals, they could take human form. And this was where their powers became most unsettling. To encounter a stranger in the desert who offered guidance could never be taken at face value. Was he a fellow traveller? Or was he something else, wearing a borrowed face? In some tales, the disguise was so perfect that even close friends or family could not tell the difference. A man might see his brother walking toward him, only to later discover that his brother had been far away at the time. The encounter was explained as a jinn in disguise, testing or deceiving him. These illusions extended to voices as well as appearances. The jinn were said to mimic human speech flawlessly, reproducing not only words but tone and rhythm. This power allowed them to call out in the voices of loved ones, luring the unwary into traps. A shepherd might hear his mother's voice calling from the hills, only to walk into dangerous ground. The deception was effective precisely because it played on trust, turning the most familiar sounds into instruments of fear. In some stories, the shape-shifting of the jinn was not merely a disguise, but a form of seduction. Men told of encounters with women of surpassing beauty who appeared suddenly in the wilderness, offering companionship and pleasure. Only later did they realize they had lain with a jinnia, a female jinn, whose beauty was a mask for something far more dangerous. Such encounters often ended with the man wasting away in sickness, drained of vitality, as if the spirit had stolen something essential from him. These stories reflected both fear of temptation and the belief that the jinn could feed upon human vitality through intimacy. The reverse was also told. Women sometimes spoke of mysterious strangers who appeared in their homes or dreams, handsome and alluring, only to vanish suddenly, leaving behind confusion and fear. These figures, too, were explained as jinn in disguise, intruding into the most intimate parts of human life. The lesson was clear. Not every face of beauty was safe, and desire could be the doorway through which the hidden folk entered. But shape-shifting was not only a means of deception or seduction. In many traditions, it was also a display of superiority. To change form at will was to demonstrate freedom from the constraints of human life. While men were bound to bodies of clay, aging, fragile, easily broken, the jinn could slip in and out of shapes as easily as fire leaps from one fuel to another. Their fluidity of form was a constant reminder of their difference, their restlessness, and their refusal to be pinned down. This power also made them useful in stories of magic. Sorcerers who claimed to command jinn often described them as appearing in many forms during rituals, sometimes as towering shadows, sometimes as animals, sometimes as human servants. The shifting of their shapes was proof of their obedience, but also of their instability. The same being could appear as one thing and then another in a heartbeat, leaving the sorcerer never fully certain what he had summoned. This uncertainty made dealings with them dangerous, for the line between control and chaos was never secure. The idea of illusion went beyond physical form. People believed that jinn could manipulate perception itself, casting glamours that made people see things that were not there. A traveller might walk for hours, believing he was following a clear path, only to realize he had been led in circles. An entire caravan might see lights in the distance, thinking they were approaching a settlement, only to find nothing but empty sand. These illusions were not random, but deliberate acts of jinn mischief or malice, demonstrations of their ability to bend reality to their will. Such stories also served as explanations for the disorienting experiences of the desert. Mirages, echoes, shifting landscapes, all were attributed to the influence of the hidden folk. By framing them as illusions cast by jinn, people gave meaning to the confusion of the natural world. The desert was not merely a place of harsh elements, but a stage where spirits manipulated perception, testing human endurance and humility. The fear of shape-shifting jinn also created strict customs around behavior. Hospitality, for example, was not only a virtue, but a safeguard. If a stranger appeared at one's door, refusing him food or shelter was dangerous, for he might not be an ordinary man at all. To honor him was to protect oneself from potential wrath. The belief that any stranger could be a jinn in disguise encouraged generosity and caution at the same time. It reinforced the idea that every interaction might carry hidden consequences. Despite the fear they inspired, shape-shifting jinn were also figures of fascination. Poets and storytellers returned again and again to their powers, weaving tales of transformations that defied imagination. The ability to move between forms captured something humans longed for but could not achieve: freedom from limitation, the capacity to be more than one thing. In this sense, the jinn reflected both fear and desire, embodying the human wish to escape the boundaries of clay while reminding them of the dangers of such power. The theme of transformation also carried moral lessons. Just as the jinn could change shape, so too could human character shift under pressure. A man who seemed honest could reveal himself to be deceitful. A woman who appeared weak could prove strong. The jinn's shapeshifting became a metaphor for the instability of life itself, the way appearances could never be trusted, the way truth was always hidden beneath layers of illusion. To live wisely was to learn to see beyond surface, to test what one encountered, and to recognize that not everything was as it first appeared. Over time, stories of shape-shifting jinn were passed down not only as warnings, but as explanations for the strange, the uncanny, and the untrustworthy. They were the reason why a man swore he saw a figure vanish into thin air, why a woman insisted she heard a familiar voice in a place where no one should have been, why entire groups of travelers agreed on sights later revealed to be false. The jinn, as masters of illusion, offered a framework for making sense of a world where perception often betrayed reality. Their powers of transformation ensured that they were never fully knowable. Even when people believed they had encountered one, there was always doubt. Was it truly a jinn? Or was it something else? Or was it merely the desert playing tricks on the senses? This ambiguity kept them alive in the imagination, for they could never be pinned down to a single form or function. They were shadows that slipped through categories, reminders that the unseen was not bound by the same rules as the seen. And so, the image of the jinn as shapeshifters endured, shaping not only folklore but daily behavior, morality, and imagination. They were the masters of disguise, the lords of illusion, the beings who proved that reality itself could be bent and twisted. To live in a world with them was to live in a world where nothing was certain, where every shadow might hide a presence, where every stranger might be more than he seemed, and where the line between truth and deception was never stable for long. Among all the figures in the long history of human encounters with the jinn, none looms larger than the prophet King Solomon, known in Arabic as Suleiman. His name is spoken with reverence across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, but in the Arabian memory of the jinn, he occupies a unique and fearful place. He is remembered not only as a wise king, but as the one man who bent the spirits of smokeless fire to his will. His reign became the great exception, the single moment in which the hidden folk, normally elusive and defiant, were brought into service under human command. The shadow of that power has haunted legends ever since. The roots of Solomon's authority over the jinn lie in scripture itself. The Quran describes how God granted him mastery over the winds, the birds, and the jinn. They worked under his command, building palaces, diving into the depths of the seas to bring up treasures, and carrying out tasks too great for ordinary human hands. This was not mere sorcery or trickery, but divine gift. It was granted to Solomon alone, a mark of his special station. The verses speak of the jinn laboring for him, bound by fear of punishment, crafting great works of bronze and glass, raising monumental structures, and serving as unseen laborers in the kingdom of a mortal man. This imagery captured the imagination of generations. To think of the jinn, those unpredictable, fiery beings who mocked and deceived ordinary men, being forced into obedience was astonishing. For most people, even to glimpse a jinn was dangerous, but Solomon was said to sit upon his throne and command entire hosts of them as if they were nothing more than soldiers or slaves. The image was one of absolute authority, proof that no being, however strange or elusive, was beyond the reach of divine order. Stories expanded upon these scriptural fragments, filling in details with folklore that spread from Arabia to Persia and beyond. In many tales, Solomon possessed a signet ring engraved with the name of God. With it he controlled the spirits, binding them to his service. Some versions claimed the ring allowed him to summon jinn from the furthest corners of the earth, to bind rebellious ones in chains of fire, and to set them to tasks they could not resist. The ring became a symbol of perfect control, a talisman that embodied the difference between Solomon's unique power and the ordinary weakness of mankind before the jinn. Legends told of jinn building the great temple in Jerusalem, lifting stones no man could carry, polishing metals to a brilliance beyond human skill. They were described as divers sent into the deep sea, bringing back pearls and corals from the dark places where no man could go. Others told of palaces of glass and bronze, wonders that dazzled visiting rulers, said to have been constructed not by human hands, but by the tireless labor of bound spirits. The association between Solomon and monumental architecture echoed in many cultures, as if the scale of his works could not be explained without invoking supernatural aid. One of the most enduring stories speaks of the Queen of Sheba, who visited Solomon to test his wisdom. In the Quran, she is described as being shown a palace with a floor so clear it seemed to her like a pool of water. Tradition held that this wonder was built by the jinn under Solomon's command, the glass so flawless it confused the eye. In this tale, the jinn were not only laborers but artisans, masters of illusion and construction, channeling their shape-shifting powers into works of lasting beauty. Their role as tricksters was inverted. Instead of deceiving men, they crafted marvels that revealed Solomon's dominion. But even within these stories of obedience, traces of rebellion lingered. Some jinn were said to resist, only to be punished severely. Folklore speaks of spirits chained beneath mountains, imprisoned in copper vessels, or hurled into distant seas by Solomon's command. These images reinforce the idea that their obedience was not willing but coerced. They served out of fear, bound by divine decree, never by choice. The jinn in these tales remained proud, resentful, and waiting for the day when Solomon's control would end. That end came, according to tradition, in a striking way. The Quran recounts that Solomon once leaned upon his staff as he oversaw the jinn working, and when death came to him, his body remained upright. The jinn, thinking he was still alive, continued their labor in fear. Only when a worm gnawed through the staff and his body collapsed did they realize he had been dead all along. The lesson was sharp. The jinn did not know the unseen, did not possess ultimate knowledge. Their power, though vast, was limited, and they too could be deceived. This story humbled them in the eyes of believers, stripping away some of the mystery that made them so feared. Yet even after Solomon's death, the memory of his command lingered. Tales of lost treasures often included references to jinn still bound by his decrees, guarding hoards of gold and jewels buried in deserts or caves. Adventurers who sought such treasures were warned that to approach them meant to face spirits chained since the days of Solomon, still bitter and still dangerous. The belief that he had sealed rebellious jinn in vessels, often described as copper or brass jars, fed into the folklore of magical lamps and bottles. Stories that would later be woven into the fabric of Arabian Nights trace their origin back to this idea, that Solomon's dominion left behind prisons filled with furious spirits waiting to be released. This connection between Solomon and the jinn also shaped ideas about legitimate versus illegitimate magic. To command the jinn through sorcery was seen as dangerous, often condemned, because it involved bargains and pacts that corrupted the soul. But Solomon's command was different. His authority was sanctioned, granted by God. This distinction separated prophetic wisdom from human arrogance. The shadow of Solomon's example meant that anyone claiming control over jinn afterward was judged against him. Most fell into suspicion of dealing with forbidden arts, for they did not possess his divine sanction. In Islamic tradition, Solomon's story was also a reminder of the jinn's limits. However powerful they seemed, they were not beyond God's will. They could be subdued, forced to labor, even deceived by death itself. This perspective kept their role balanced. They were dangerous but not invincible, mysterious but not divine. They were subjects of the same Creator who granted one man the authority to rule them utterly. For believers, this affirmed that fear of the jinn should never outweigh fear of God, whose power encompassed even the spirits of fire. Still, the allure of Solomon's dominion remained irresistible in popular imagination. To imagine him seated on a throne, commanding both men and spirits, was to imagine a kingdom where the natural and supernatural were united in harmony under a single ruler. His reign became the golden image of order, the one time when the hidden folk were brought fully into the service of human civilization. Every later tale of sorcerers binding jinn echoed back to his legend, whether in imitation or in defiance. The shadow of Solomon stretched long, shaping how people understood not only the jinn, but the very boundaries of human authority. Even today, in villages and stories told at night, his name appears in connection with the jinn. A man might claim that a ruin is guarded by spirits, sealed there since Solomon's time. A grandmother might warn her grandchildren that speaking rudely at night could draw the attention of jinn still bitter over their ancient bondage. The past never feels fully past in such stories. The memory of the king who commanded spirits remains alive, a reminder that the hidden folk can be subdued, but only under the rarest and most extraordinary circumstances. The story of Solomon's dominion illustrates something essential about the way the jinn are remembered. They are powerful, but not supreme. They are elusive, but not beyond control. Their nature as tricksters, teachers, whisperers, and shapeshifters is bound by a greater order, one that occasionally reveals itself in the figure of a man chosen to stand above them. His shadow still falls across the legends, shaping every later encounter, every tale of hidden treasures, every whisper of forbidden magic. For as long as people tell stories of the jinn, they will tell stories of the king who once commanded them, and of the uneasy obedience that defined their service. Among the many types of jinn described in Arabian memory, none has provoked more dread than the Ifrit. To speak of an Ifrit was not to speak of an ordinary spirit or the mischievous trickster of nightly tales. It was to speak of a lord of fire, a being defined by wrath, cruelty, and unyielding strength. In the popular imagination, the Ifrit stood as the embodiment of everything terrifying about the jinn, magnified into monstrous scale. They were not the hidden folk who lingered quietly in ruins or whispered temptations into human ears. They were the warriors, the destroyers, the ones who struck with open malice and left devastation behind. The origins of the word itself carry the sense of rebellion. In Arabic, the term Ifrit is often associated with one who is insolent, defiant, and beyond restraint. To call a jinni an Ifrit was to acknowledge that it was not merely mischievous or stubborn, but openly hostile, a creature whose very identity was tied to its refusal to submit. In this sense, the Ifrit was imagined as an extreme among the jinn, the kind that most clearly reflected the arrogance of Iblis himself. If ordinary jinn might vary between belief and disbelief, between helpfulness and mischief, the Ifrit was almost always placed on the side of rebellion and harm. Descriptions of the Ifrit vary, but they are often imagined as towering figures of fire, massive in form, their bodies wreathed in flame or smoke. Some stories portray them as winged, moving through the air with a swiftness beyond human comprehension. Others describe them as having forms too dreadful to look upon directly, their features warped by fire into shapes half human, half demonic. Whatever the details, the constant element was their terrifying presence. To encounter an Ifrit was not to be deceived or tricked, but to be confronted with raw, destructive power. Tales of Ifrits often emphasize their strength and ferocity. In stories recited across centuries, they are described as dwelling in ruins, deserts, and burial grounds, places already marked by desolation. Unlike lesser jinn, who might be approached or placated, the Ifrit was rarely imagined as one who could be bargained with. Their nature was to resist, to mock human attempts at control, and to strike with violence when provoked. This made them the perfect symbols of the dangers that lurked in places abandoned by life, the embodiment of the belief that desolation itself was a form of haunting. In the Quran, the word Ifrit appears in the story of Solomon, when Solomon asked who could bring him the throne of the Queen of Sheba before she arrived. An Ifrit among the jinn stepped forward, boasting that he could do so before Solomon rose from his seat. His confidence and strength were clear, but even here the Ifrit is placed in a position of limitation. For another servant, one who possessed knowledge of the divine scripture, accomplished the task instantly, outstripping the Ifrit's boast. The story illustrates both the power and the limits of the Ifrit, formidable among the jinn, yet still subject to forces greater than their fiery strength. In folklore, the Ifrit became a symbol of vengeance. Tales describe them rising against those who dared to disturb graves, punishing the desecration of burial places with merciless fury. Others speak of them haunting wells and springs, striking down those who approached with arrogance. Their wrath was not always random, it was often tied to human provocation. But their responses were so violent that even innocent mistakes could bring fatal consequences. A man who failed to show respect at a ruin might find himself attacked in the night, his camp destroyed, his life cut short by fire. The Ifrit also became a figure in magical traditions. Sorcerers who sought to bind jinn sometimes aimed specifically for the power of an Ifrit, hoping to command its strength. These attempts were always portrayed as perilous. The Ifrit might appear to obey for a time, but it waited for any sign of weakness to break free and turn on its would-be master. Folk tales are filled with warnings of magicians destroyed by the very spirits they tried to enslave. The lesson was clear. To summon an Ifrit was to court destruction, for no human art could truly hold them. In popular tales, especially those collected in later centuries, Ifrits appear as antagonists in grand adventures. Heroes are described as battling them with swords, prayers, or cunning, sometimes defeating them through faith, sometimes through sheer bravery. These stories reinforce the image of the Ifrit as the ultimate opponent, the kind of enemy that could only be faced by those of exceptional strength or divine favor. To defeat an Ifrit was to prove oneself a hero of extraordinary stature, for ordinary men had no hope against such beings. The association of Ifrits with fire also carried symbolic weight. Fire was a constant presence in desert life, both necessary and feared. It gave warmth, cooked food, and warded off predators, but it could also consume tents, destroy crops, and bring death in an instant. The Ifrit embodied this duality in its most dangerous form. It was fire unrestrained, fire that did not serve but dominated. In this sense, stories of the Ifrit were not only about spirits, but about humanity's relationship with the most destructive element of nature. Unlike some other jinn who were seen as capable of belief or redemption, the Ifrit was rarely given such qualities. They were almost always described as proud, arrogant, and hostile. Their role in stories was to challenge, to embody the opposition to order, to remind listeners that some forces could not be reasoned with. This made them essential figures in the moral imagination, not because they offered guidance or subtle lessons, but because they represented the ever-present possibility of chaos breaking into human life. The endurance of the Ifrit in popular culture reflects the power of this image. In later Arabic literature, they appear as stock figures of supernatural strength, the kind of adversaries who tested the courage of heroes. In modern times, they have been reimagined in countless ways, from novels to films, but always retaining their association with fire and wrath. Their persistence shows how deeply the figure resonated, how the fear of unrestrained fire, of violent rebellion, continues to echo across centuries. Yet even in their terrifying role, Ifrits were not entirely alien. They were still jinn, still part of the same creation, still bound by the same divine laws. The Quran's brief mention reminds readers that even the most powerful of them were not beyond the limits of God's will. This tension between their overwhelming presence in folklore and their ultimate subordination in scripture is part of what made them compelling. They were terrifying, yes, but not untouchable. Their wrath was immense, but it was still subject to something higher. To speak of the Ifrit was therefore to speak of the extremes of the jinn, the point where their fiery nature was most fully expressed. They were lords of fire not only in appearance but in spirit, restless, destructive, proud, and consuming. They embodied the fears of the desert night, the dangers of arrogance, the threat of chaos. And yet, by placing them within the larger order of creation, tradition ensured that they remained warnings rather than hopeless terrors. They were the embodiment of wrath, but even wrath had its limits. The Ifrit, then, continues to stand in stories as a reminder of the dangers that come with power unchecked, of the fire that cannot be contained, of the wrath that destroys everything in its path. They are not the jinn who whisper or deceive quietly. They are the ones who announce themselves in flame and smoke, who leave ruins where once there was safety. To remember them is to remember that the world is never fully tame, that fire always burns close, and that some spirits exist only to remind us of how fragile the boundary is between order and destruction. Among the many categories of jinn that populated Arabian imagination, the Marid held a special place. If the Ifrit was remembered as a lord of fire, fierce and wrathful, the Marid was remembered as a giant of the waters, a being of immense pride whose power was as vast as the seas themselves. To speak of a Marid was to speak of something far rarer than the jinn who lurked in ruins or whispered in shadows. They were not the hidden folk of nightly cautionary tales, but beings of stature and arrogance, who appeared in legends as obstacles or prizes, guardians of treasures, or mighty forces that even magicians feared to command. The very name Marid carries the sense of rebellion and defiance. In Arabic, it suggests something insubordinate, a being that refuses to bow. Like the Ifrit, the Marid was described as one of the most dangerous classes of jinn, not merely mischievous, but openly hostile, with immense strength. But unlike the Ifrit, the Marid was associated with water rather than fire. They were said to dwell in seas, rivers, and remote oceans, inhabiting depths that no diver could reach, and from there, they looked upon the world of men with disdain. The desert tribes knew the sea as something distant and strange, a realm of danger, storms, and unknown creatures. To imagine jinn inhabiting that realm was natural. The Marid became the embodiment of the vastness and unpredictability of the deep. Legends often describe Marids as towering giants, sometimes beautiful, sometimes monstrous, but always overwhelming in scale. They were not the nimble spirits that flickered in and out of sight. They were massive presences, slow to appear, but impossible to ignore. When a Marid entered a story, it was never as a subtle whisperer or a trickster in disguise. It came as an open force, announcing itself with crashing waves, storms, or voices that shook the very air. They were the giants of the jinn world, proud in a way that made them dangerous to confront. In many tales, the Marid was the keeper of treasure. Great hoards of gold, jewels, and magical objects were said to lie buried beneath the sea, guarded by these proud spirits. Sailors whispered that to dive in certain waters was to risk the wrath of a Marid, who would not allow mortals to touch what it considered its own. Stories of such guardianship became entwined with human greed. Heroes who sought wealth often found themselves bargaining with or battling Marids, learning the hard way that prideful giants of the deep did not surrender their riches easily. Bargaining with a Marid was a theme that appeared again and again in folk tales. Unlike lesser jinn, who might be tricked or cajoled, a Marid demanded long rituals, costly sacrifices, or displays of immense persistence. Magicians in stories spent days fasting, chanting incantations, and offering gifts to summon one. Even then, the Marid might refuse, mocking the weakness of human effort. The idea was clear. Their pride was such that nothing short of extraordinary effort could move them. To compel a Marid was considered a triumph of sorcery, proof that the magician had achieved the highest level of dangerous knowledge. Yet the danger of such bargains was always present. The Marid's obedience, if achieved at all, was never secure. Their pride meant they looked for any excuse to twist agreements, to break free, or to turn the tables on their summoners. Folk tales abound with accounts of men who thought they had bound a Marid, only to find themselves drowned at sea, crushed by storms, or deceived into ruin. These stories reinforce the moral lesson that arrogance could not be safely harnessed, that human attempts to master forces beyond their nature were bound to end in destruction. One of the reasons Marids captured so much imagination was their connection to water. For desert peoples, the sea was both fascinating and terrifying. It offered riches through trade, but also swallowed ships and men without mercy. The sea's unpredictability, the way it could shift from calm to violent in an instant, mirrored the Marid's reputation for pride and sudden wrath. To attribute storms, shipwrecks, and monstrous creatures to the presence of these spirits made sense of the dangers of ocean travel. The Marid became the explanation for why some voyages ended in triumph while others ended in tragedy. Stories from sailors often blurred into descriptions of sea creatures, mixing the natural and the supernatural. Enormous fish, whales, or strange shapes glimpsed in the depths were described as Marids in disguise. The belief that they could change form, like other jinn, allowed them to be associated with any uncanny sight in the ocean. A sudden whirlpool could be seen as the breath of a Marid. A glowing light beneath the waves might be its presence moving in the deep. The ocean itself became a stage where their pride and power could be imagined without limits. In literary traditions, especially in the tales that later became part of the 1001 Nights, Marids appear as antagonists of great renown. They are often described as imprisoned in bottles or lamps, sealed by the commands of Solomon or other figures of authority. When released, they erupt in fury, boasting of their strength and threatening destruction. Heroes are forced to use cunning, not just strength, to outwit them, tricking them back into confinement or forcing them into service. These stories amplified their reputation as proud beings whose arrogance made them vulnerable to cleverness. The motif of the Marid trapped in a vessel became one of the most enduring images of jinn in world folklore. But even in these tales, their pride remained central. A Marid never obeyed willingly. If it served, it did so begrudgingly, often plotting revenge or waiting for the moment to break free. This characteristic distinguished them from other jinn who might on occasion befriend or aid humans. The Marid was almost always hostile, or at best contemptuous. To deal with one was to step into a contest of wills, where human weakness could easily be exposed. The Marid also became a symbol of wealth and abundance, but wealth that was always dangerous to pursue. Their hoards of treasure under the sea tempted men to risk everything, but those who sought them often lost their lives. This image reflected the broader truth that great riches often come with great peril, that the pursuit of fortune beyond one's means invites destruction. In this sense, Marid stories carried moral lessons as much as they carried fear. Despite their hostility, the Marid were not entirely outside the order of creation. Islamic tradition, while acknowledging the variety among the jinn, always placed them within the framework of divine will. Like humans, they could choose belief or disbelief, obedience or rebellion. While folklore almost always portrayed them as arrogant and defiant, the possibility remained that even a Marid could submit. This tension added depth to their image, for it meant that no matter how terrible their pride, they were still bound by the same ultimate reality as all beings. Their endurance in popular imagination owes much to the way they embodied extremes. They were the jinn at their most massive, their most prideful, their most untouchable. They inhabited the ocean, a realm alien to desert life, making them seem even more distant and powerful. They guarded wealth, but punished greed. They demanded sacrifice, but offered treachery in return. They were not simply enemies, but challenges, figures that tested human bravery, cunning, and humility all at once. Over centuries, the Marid became one of the archetypes through which people thought about danger and pride. They were giants of the unseen world, but their qualities echoed in human behavior as well. Just as a Marid might be brought low by arrogance, so too could men. The stories about them were not only about spirits, but about the dangers of excessive pride and the futility of trying to master forces beyond one's reach. And so, the Marid remained in the imagination as the proud giants of the deep, the beings whose domain was as vast and merciless as the sea itself. They were feared, sometimes sought after, always respected, but never trusted. Their pride defined them, their strength distinguished them, and their place in the lore of the jinn ensured that they would never be forgotten. Whether imagined as roaring giants rising from the waves or as imprisoned beings raging in bottles, they remained symbols of arrogance unbound, the deep's eternal reminder that not all treasures are meant to be claimed. If the Marid belonged to the oceans and the Ifrit to the blazing heart of fire, then the Ghoul belonged to the barren wilderness. Among all the jinn remembered in Arabian lore, none embodied fear of the wastelands more than the Ghoul. Their name became so deeply ingrained in imagination that it spread far beyond Arabia, finding its way into languages and cultures across the world. carrying with it the enduring sense of dread that these beings inspired. To speak of the ghoul was to speak of the predator, the ambusher, the creature who waited in lonely places to devour the unsuspecting. They were not merely tricksters or whisperers. They were hunters, and humanity was their prey. The word itself is thought to come from a root meaning to seize or snatch away, a fitting origin for beings whose entire identity revolved around ambush and predation. In Arabian memory, the ghoul lurked in deserts, graveyards, abandoned ruins, and crossroads. They were not the distant giants of the sea, but immediate threats, always waiting in the kinds of places travelers had to cross if they wished to survive. For people whose lives depended on long journeys across lonely terrain, the fear of ghouls was not abstract. It was as practical and pressing as the fear of thirst or exposure. Descriptions of the ghoul varied, but most traditions portrayed them as shapeshifters, a trait they shared with other jinn. They could appear as ordinary people, often as women, beautiful or pitiful, standing alone in the desert as if in need of help. A passing traveler, moved by compassion or desire, might approach only to find himself seized by claws and torn apart. Other times, the ghoul appeared as an animal, a dog or hyena, leading men astray before revealing its true nature. These stories reflected the constant suspicion that appearances in the wilderness could never be trusted, that kindness or curiosity might lead to disaster. More grotesque depictions describe the ghoul in monstrous form, twisted faces, elongated limbs, eyes glowing with unnatural light. In some tales, they were described as feeding on corpses, haunting graveyards to dig up the dead. This detail cemented their role as creatures of corruption, defilers of the boundary between life and death. The ghoul was not just a predator of the living, but a desecrator of the dead, a being that thrived on the most feared and forbidden acts. In this sense, they were both physical and moral threats, embodying not only the dangers of the wilderness, but the terror of spiritual defilement. Arabian poets of the pre-Islamic period sometimes used the ghoul as a metaphor for the horrors of the desert. In their verses, the ghoul represented exhaustion, despair, and the ever-present possibility of death. Travelers spoke of mirages, strange lights, and voices in the night as signs of their presence. If a caravan wandered off course, or a man collapsed in the sands, people whispered that the ghouls had struck. These stories reinforced the idea that death in the desert was never natural, that unseen predators always lingered, waiting for weakness. One of the most striking qualities of the ghoul was its hunger. Unlike some jinn who might tempt, deceive, or even aid, the ghoul seemed driven by nothing but the need to consume. This voracious appetite made them the ultimate predators in the imagination. They were not content with simple trickery. They desired flesh, blood, and bone. To imagine them was to confront the fear that in the wilderness, one was not only lost but hunted. The ghoul also embodied the dangers of isolation. Many tales warned against traveling alone, especially at night. Solitary figures were most vulnerable, for the ghoul struck when no one was there to help. This belief reinforced communal values, encouraging people to travel in groups, to support one another, and to avoid unnecessary risks. The ghoul became not only a supernatural predator, but a social warning against isolation and recklessness. The arrival of Islam reshaped the figure of the ghoul without erasing it. The Prophet Muhammad is reported in traditions to have warned against them, describing them as deceptive beings who could be countered through prayer and remembrance of God. Some accounts even tell of the Prophet himself confronting a ghoul, striking it down or banishing it. These stories reaffirm that ghouls were real, but not invincible, dangerous, but subject to divine power. The shift placed them firmly within the category of jinn, dangerous rebels who thrived on harming humans, but who could be resisted by faith. Folk traditions continued to portray the ghoul in countless variations. Some described entire tribes of them, living together in desolate places, waging war against human settlements. Others spoke of solitary ghouls haunting specific roads or wells. In some versions, they were female more often than male, perhaps because of the association with luring men through seduction or pity. Whatever their form, their nature remained the same: hunger, deception, and violence. The fear of ghouls also extended into daily practices. Parents warned children not to wander outside at night, not simply because of wild animals, but because of the ghouls. Women drawing water from wells recited prayers for protection, lest something reach up from the darkness below. Travelers spoke of carrying charms or reciting verses to guard against attacks. These customs made the ghoul part of ordinary life, not as distant myth, but as a constant consideration in survival. The reputation of the ghoul eventually spread beyond Arabia, carried by translations and stories that moved into Persian, Greek, and later European traditions. The Arabic ghoul became the French ghoul, and from there, the English ghoul, a word that still carries associations with graveyards and horror. This spread shows how deeply the figure resonated, how its themes of predation, desecration, and fear of the dead struck chords across cultures. The Arabian ghoul became a global symbol of monstrosity, one of the few jinn whose name survived intact in other languages. In literature, ghouls often appear as antagonists in tales of adventure, much like ifrits and marids. Heroes were described as confronting them in lonely places, defeating them with swords or cleverness, proving their bravery against creatures that thrived on human fear. These stories allowed listeners to imagine victory over the terrors of the desert, to transform dread into triumph through narrative. The ghoul's presence in such tales reinforced both the dangers of the world and the possibility of overcoming them. But even when defeated in stories, the ghoul remained unsettling. Unlike other jinn, they seemed less capable of reason or redemption. They were not teachers or companions, but predators. Their hunger made them alien in a way that few other spirits were. To think of them was to think of danger that could not be negotiated with, only resisted or destroyed. This absolute hostility set them apart, making them some of the most frightening figures in Arabian imagination. The endurance of the ghoul reflects its deep connection to universal fears. The wilderness, the grave, isolation, hunger, all are human experiences that carry with them profound dread. By embodying these fears in the figure of the ghoul, Arabian culture gave shape to the inescapable realities of life. The ghoul was not simply a monster, but a mirror of human vulnerability, a reminder of the thin line between survival and death. And so the ghoul remains one of the most vivid images among the jinn, the predator of the wastelands, the desecrator of graves, the figure who waits at the edges of human life. To remember them is to remember that the wilderness is never empty, that isolation is never safe, and that hunger, whether of man or spirit, can consume everything if left unchecked. They stand as warnings, as predators, as shadows cast long across the sands of memory, ensuring that even today, when the word ghoul is spoken, it carries with it the echo of ancient fear. If the ghoul represented the predator of the wilderness, savage and unrelenting, Then the Silat embodied a subtler kind of danger. These were not spirits that ambushed openly or struck with claws in the dark. They were the deceivers, the ones who moved with grace and beauty, using seduction rather than brute force, weaving illusions that ensnared the heart and clouded the mind. To speak of a Silat was to speak of temptation given form, of a jinn whose greatest power lay not in its strength, but in its ability to beguile. The Silat was often described as female, though stories did not limit them entirely to one gender. Their defining quality was beauty, but it was a beauty that concealed malice. Unlike the ghoul, who terrified by grotesque form, the Silat terrified by the very perfection of their disguise. They appeared as women of surpassing loveliness, sometimes alone in the desert, sometimes at wells or crossroads, sometimes even within villages. Their presence stirred desire and pity alike. A man who saw them thought he had encountered a lost traveller or a woman in distress, and his instincts of chivalry or lust drew him closer. But behind the veil of beauty was a spirit waiting to entrap him. Arabian lore described the Silat as masters of shape and voice. They did not merely wear the mask of beauty, but perfected it, mimicking human behavior, speech, and gestures so flawlessly that even the cautious could be deceived. This made them uniquely dangerous. Where other jinn might betray themselves through some flaw, an unnatural movement, a strange shadow, the Silat was said to leave no trace of their true nature until it was too late. They were predators of perception, feeding on trust itself. The stories of the Silat often revolved around encounters between men and women. For men, the Silat appeared as beautiful companions, promising love or comfort. Folklore tells of wanderers who fell in love with such beings, only to waste away, their vitality drained by the relationship. Some versions describe the Silat as feeding on human life force, leaving their victims hollow and weakened. Others simply depict them as cruel deceivers, leading men into isolation and then vanishing, leaving despair in their wake. The lesson was consistent. Desire unchecked was a pathway to ruin. For women, the Silat sometimes appeared as strangers offering friendship or guidance. In these tales, the deception was less about seduction and more about manipulation, drawing women into danger or sowing discord in their families. The Silat was said to thrive on chaos, and their beauty and charm allowed them to weave it with ease. The warning here was broader. Trust, even among those who appeared kind, had to be tempered with caution, for the deceiver could wear any face. Unlike the ghoul, whose hunger was obvious, the Silat's motives were more complex. Some stories suggested they simply enjoyed the act of deception, feeding on the humiliation of those they fooled. Others described them as needing human vitality, sustained by the energy they drained through intimacy or companionship. Still others portrayed them as simply cruel, wreaking havoc for no purpose beyond their own amusement. This ambiguity made them more frightening, for one never knew whether an encounter was a test, a trap, or a feeding. The Silat also blurred the boundary between jinn and human relationships. Stories of men marrying them, unknowingly or knowingly, circulated widely. At first the union seemed perfect. The wife was beautiful, skilled, and attentive. But over time, signs emerged. Strange behavior at night, sudden disappearances, children with unusual traits. The revelation that the wife was a Silat often shattered the family, leaving tragedy behind. These tales reflected anxieties about marriage, trust, and the fear that even within the home, deception might lurk. One of the qualities most often attributed to the Silat was their voice. They were said to speak with sweetness that dissolved suspicion, to sing with tones that mesmerized, to laugh in ways that disarmed the wary. Their voices carried the same deceptive perfection as their forms, making them impossible to resist for those unguarded. Some tales went further, claiming that their voices could cloud judgment, implanting suggestions in the minds of their listeners, guiding them into choices they would later regret. The Seelat's weapon was not the claw or the blade, but the word, the glance, the song. In the broader imagination, the Seelat became the embodiment of deceit. They represented the dangers not of wilderness or graveyards, but of desire, illusion, and misplaced trust. Their presence in folklore reflected the constant awareness that appearances can lie, that beauty can conceal destruction, that charm can be a mask for cruelty. For societies that valued honor, caution, and fidelity, the Seelat served as powerful symbols of the risks that came with abandoning restraint. Islamic tradition incorporated them within the larger category of jinn, acknowledging that some among the hidden folk could deceive so thoroughly. Religious texts warned against temptation, against being led astray by appearances, and in popular belief, the Seelat became part of this warning. The remedies against them were the same as those against other jinn: prayer, remembrance, and faith. The belief was that deception could not pierce the shield of sincere worship, that even the most beguiling Seelat could not withstand the authority of God's words. Still, in popular stories, they remained figures of fascination as much as fear. Their beauty, their cleverness, their ability to blend seamlessly into human life made them compelling antagonists. Heroes were often tested by them, forced to see through the illusion and resist temptation. Success in these tales was not only a victory over a spirit, but proof of moral strength, the ability to discern truth beneath appearances. The Seelat thus became teachers of caution through their very danger. Beyond Arabian tradition, echoes of the Seelat appear in other cultures, often under different names. The idea of spirits who deceive through beauty, who lure men to ruin, appears in Greek tales of sirens, in European legends of fairies, in countless myths across the world. The Seelat fit into this wider pattern, showing how universal the fear of deceptive beauty is. Their place in Arabian lore gave local shape to a theme that resonates everywhere: the danger of trusting appearances, the peril of desire unchecked, the destructive power of lies woven with charm. Even today, the memory of the Seelat lingers in the language of deception. To call someone enchanting or bewitching carries echoes of this old fear, that beauty and charm may be nothing more than disguises for something darker. The Seelat remain in stories told to warn, to entertain, to remind. They are not the monsters that strike openly, but the deceivers who erode trust, the illusions that turn love into despair, the voices that guide travelers into ruin. They stand as proof that the greatest dangers are not always those that roar or strike, but those that smile and beckon, wrapping destruction in beauty. Among all the beliefs about the jinn, none is more intimate, more unsettling than the idea of the Quran. The word means companion, but this is no ordinary friend or partner. It is the spirit believed to be bound to every human being from birth until death, a presence that follows silently, invisible but persistent, whispering, tempting, and at times even guiding. Unlike other jinn who dwell in deserts, ruins, or seas, the Quran is never far away. It is tied to the individual, closer than shadow, a companion in the truest, but most troubling sense. The concept of the Quran appears in Islamic tradition, and it is rooted in sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. He is reported to have said that every person is assigned a companion from among the jinn, one who accompanies them through life. When asked about himself, he explained that his Quran had submitted to God and therefore no longer tempted him. For ordinary people, however, the Quran was seen as a constant source of whispering, encouraging sinful thoughts, magnifying desires, and pushing them toward weakness. This teaching shaped the imagination of generations. To speak of temptation was often to speak of the Quran at work. What made the Quran so unsettling was its inescapability. Other jinn could be avoided. One could refrain from wandering into ruins, avoid whistling at night, or recite protective prayers before entering lonely places. But the Quran could not be left behind. It was tied to the self, present in every place and every moment. A man could not flee from it, for wherever he went, it was there. It was not outside, but within reach of thought, whispering in the heart, shaping desires and doubts. The presence of the Quran explained the uncanny persistence of certain temptations. A person might wonder why the same weakness returned again and again, why moments of prayer were broken by distractions, why anger rose so quickly, or why fear clouded judgment. The answer offered by tradition was that the Quran was constantly at work, exploiting every vulnerability. It did not need to appear in monstrous form or frighten with shadows. Its strength lay in constancy. It was always there, waiting, pressing against the edges of the soul. Yet the Quran was not imagined as invincible. While it whispered, it could not command. Its power lay in suggestion, not compulsion. This distinction was crucial. The presence of the Quran explained temptation, but responsibility remained with the human being. To sin was still a choice, not a fate. The struggle with the Quran was framed as part of the greater struggle of life, the battle to resist temptation, to discipline the self, to remain faithful despite the constant voice urging otherwise. It was both an enemy and a test, one that shaped the very meaning of human existence. Stories about the Quran often emphasized its role in everyday life. When someone acted out of sudden impulse, people would say it was the Quran whispering. When they struggled to maintain concentration in worship, they blamed the constant presence of their unseen companion. In this way, the Quran became part of the explanation for the inner battles that everyone recognized. Life was not only a struggle against external challenges, but against the unseen voice within, the companion who never departed. Some traditions describe the Quran as a double, a spirit that mirrored the human it accompanied. Just as each person had their own life, their own character, so too their Quran was tied to them uniquely. This idea gave rise to the belief that no two Quran were the same, that each reflected the weaknesses and inclinations of the person it followed. For some, it might emphasize pride. For others, anger. For others still, lust or fear. In this way, the Quran became almost like a dark reflection of the self, a constant reminder of the parts of one's character that needed discipline. The idea of a spirit double is not unique to Arabia. In many cultures, there are beliefs about shadow companions, spirits tied to individuals from birth. What makes the Arabian idea of the Quran distinct is the emphasis on temptation. It was not merely a neutral double, but one that actively sought to mislead. Its companionship was never benevolent but always dangerous. To live with it was to live with a constant adversary, one that could never be entirely silenced, but only resisted through vigilance and faith. The religious traditions surrounding the Quran offered remedies for its influence. Constant remembrance of God, recitation of scripture, and prayer were said to weaken its whispers. The belief was that the Quran could not withstand the presence of faith. Its voice grew faint when confronted with the words of divine truth. For many, this was a source of hope. Even though they could not escape their companion, they could resist it, and in resisting it, they could grow stronger. The struggle itself became a form of spiritual training, sharpening discipline and deepening devotion. In folk tales, the Quran sometimes appeared in more dramatic form. People spoke of seeing their doubles in dreams, or of feeling another presence moving with them. In some accounts, sorcerers were said to exploit the Quran, using it to manipulate or harm its human counterpart. This gave rise to fears of possession, the idea that the Quran could sometimes seize control of the body if given enough opportunity. While such tales blurred the line between the Quran and other forms of jinn possession, they reinforced the sense that this companion was not passive, but actively dangerous. What set the Quran apart from other jinn was its intimacy. Ghouls and silat might lurk outside, waiting for opportunities, but the Quran was inside the circle of life itself. It was tied to birth, present in every breath, and waiting at death. Some traditions even suggested that the Quran remained until the Day of Judgment, testifying against its human in the final reckoning. This gave it a role not only in life, but in the larger arc of existence, a witness to every choice, a companion until the very end. The Quran also provided a way to think about responsibility and mercy. Because everyone was believed to have one, no one could claim to be free of temptation. Every human being struggled with whispers, doubts, and desires. This shared condition created a sense of solidarity, a recognition that weakness was universal. At the same time, it emphasized the importance of resisting. To surrender to the Quran was to fail in the most basic struggle of existence, but to resist it was to fulfill one's purpose. The Quran thus turned temptation into a universal test, one that bound all people together in a shared challenge. The endurance of this belief speaks to its profound resonance. People do not need to see their Quran to believe in it. The experience of temptation, the voice that seems to come from nowhere, the constant return of weakness. These are realities everyone knows. By giving them a name, by framing them as the work of a constant companion, tradition made sense of the inner struggle. The Quran became the explanation for the inexplicable, the way to speak of the battle within the heart. And so the Quran remains one of the most intimate figures in the lore of the jinn, the spirit that walks with every human, the companion that whispers but does not compel, the adversary that shapes the meaning of life itself. It is not the distant monster of the desert or the proud giant of the sea, but the quiet voice at the edge of thought, always present, always pressing. To remember the Quran is to remember that no one walks alone, and that the greatest battles are not fought in deserts or oceans, but within the hidden chambers of the heart. When Islam emerged in Arabia, the belief in jinn was already deeply ingrained in the culture. For centuries, poets, travelers, and storytellers had spoken of spirits that haunted the deserts, ruins, and lonely roads, shaping a worldview where the unseen was always near. Islam did not deny their existence nor dismiss them as superstition. Instead, it took that pre-existing belief and placed it within the larger framework of revelation, binding the jinn into the same moral and theological order that governed humanity. From that moment on, the jinn were not merely figures of fear or fascination. They became part of a faith that defined their nature, their limits, and their place in creation. The Quran refers to the jinn repeatedly, acknowledging them as beings created from smokeless fire, distinct from humans created from clay, and angels created from light. They were not illusions, not distant metaphors, but real creatures, living with intelligence, will, and accountability. Like humans, they were given freedom of choice, the ability to believe or to disbelieve, to obey or to rebel. This teaching was revolutionary in its clarity. It stripped away the sense that jinn were purely demonic forces. Instead, it placed them firmly in the same moral universe as mankind. They too were subjects of God, judged by their actions, divided between the faithful and the defiant. Entire passages of the Quran are dedicated to them. In one account, a group of jinn hear the recitation of the Quran and are moved by its truth. They return to their own kind, warning them and urging them to listen. This moment reframes the jinn not simply as tempters of men, but as potential believers, capable of spreading divine guidance within their own ranks. It reveals that Islam is not a faith limited to humanity, but a universal call that reaches across the boundaries of creation. At the same time, the Quran is clear about the dangers posed by the jinn. Among them are devils, the shayatin, who whisper, tempt, and mislead. Chief among them is Iblis, who refused to bow to Adam and was cast out, vowing to misguide humanity. His story is not just about pride, but about the ongoing struggle between temptation and obedience. By identifying Iblis as one of the jinn, the Quran redefined the cosmic conflict of good and evil. It was no longer only about angels and men, but also about these fiery beings who shared the world with us. Islamic teaching emphasized that while the jinn are powerful, they are not beyond the will of God. They live, they die. They will be resurrected and judged like all creatures. Their powers, shape-shifting, whispering, deceiving, are real but limited. They cannot override divine will. This teaching brought balance. Where pre-Islamic Arabs might have seen the jinn as overwhelming forces to be feared absolutely, Islam placed them in their proper place. Dangerous, yes, but not ultimate. Fear of them was tempered by the greater fear and trust in God. The presence of the jinn in Islamic theology also helped explain the reality of temptation and evil without stripping humans of responsibility. The whispers of the jinn were acknowledged, but so was the fact that they only suggest, never compel. A person misled by them still chose to follow. This reinforced the sense of personal accountability while acknowledging the unseen struggle that believers felt within themselves. It balanced external influence with internal choice. In the Hadith traditions, the Prophet Muhammad spoke frequently about the jinn, offering guidance on how to live with their presence. He warned of their tricks, their ability to influence thoughts, and their tendency to haunt lonely places. At the same time, he offered practical protections, prayers to recite when entering homes, eating food, or setting out on journeys. He instructed that even simple acts, like covering food at night or closing doors, should be done in God's name, for it kept the jinn from interfering. These teachings wove awareness of the jinn into daily religious practice, making faith not just a matter of belief, but of constant vigilance. The Prophet also emphasized that not all jinn were hostile. Some had embraced Islam, others had chosen disbelief. This reminder was important. It prevented the demonization of the entire race and reinforced the universality of the message. Still, he acknowledged that their influence was often harmful, especially through whispers and temptations. This balanced view, neither denying nor exaggerating their role, shaped how Muslims understood the unseen world for centuries. As Islamic scholarship developed, theologians debated the exact nature of the jinn. Some focused on their creation from fire, interpreting it literally as beings of flame, others more metaphorically as a symbol of their restless, shifting essence. Scholars discuss their capabilities, whether they could truly possess humans, whether they could move physical objects, how far their knowledge extended. While opinions varied, the consensus was that they were real, that they shared the earth with us, and that they remained subject to God's authority. One of the most significant theological contributions was the recognition of the parallel between humans and jinn. Both were seen as communities with prophets, families, societies, and destinies. This parallel blurred the boundary between the visible and the invisible. It reinforced the idea that the world was more crowded than it appeared, that life was shared with another creation running alongside our own. For believers, this deepened the sense of humility and vigilance. They were not alone in their moral struggle. Another realm was engaged in the same choices, facing the same accountability. Fear of the jinn persisted, of course. People still avoided ruins at night, still recited prayers before pouring water, still blamed sudden misfortunes on their interference. But alongside fear was faith, the belief that God's protection was stronger than any spirit's mischief. This duality gave people both caution and confidence. They could acknowledge the reality of the jinn without being enslaved by terror. The teachings of Islam provided tools, remembrance, prayer, trust that reframed the relationship from helpless fear to managed vigilance. Folklore continued to thrive alongside theology. People told stories of poets inspired by jinn, of magicians bargaining with them, of travelers encountering them on lonely roads. These stories often blended into popular belief, creating a tapestry where religion and folklore intermingled. Yet even in these tales, the imprint of Islamic teaching was clear. The jinn might deceive, but they could be resisted through faith. They might tempt, but they could not compel. They might terrify, but they could not escape judgment. The existence of the jinn also reinforced one of the central themes of Islam, that the unseen is as real as the seen. Just as angels exist beyond human perception, so too do the jinn. Just as God himself is unseen, so too are his creatures. Belief in the unseen is a cornerstone of faith, and the jinn served as a constant reminder of this truth. Their presence kept the unseen close, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily reality woven into life. In this way, the jinn occupied a unique place between fear and faith. They were feared as deceivers, predators, and tempters, yet they were also acknowledged as fellow creatures of God, bound by the same law and subject to the same destiny. They represented the dangers of the unseen, but also the order that bound all creation together. Their place in Islam ensured that they would never be dismissed as superstition, nor exalted as gods. They were what they were, beings of fire, hidden yet near, dangerous yet limited, constant companions in the human story of faith and struggle. And so, the jinn remained not only in folklore, but in faith itself, reminders of temptation, warnings of arrogance, symbols of danger, and yet fellow subjects of the Creator. They stood at the intersection of fear and faith, embodying the truth that the unseen is always present, always shaping, always reminding humanity that the world is far larger than what the eyes can see. Of all the ways people have imagined their relationship with the jinn, none has carried more fascination, dread, and moral weight than the idea of making a pact. The jinn were not only neighbors in ruins, whisperers in the dark, or predators of the wasteland. They were also seen as potential allies in the pursuit of hidden knowledge and forbidden power. This possibility drew men and women into dangerous paths, where desire for control, wealth, or revenge overcame caution. To make a pact with the jinn was to attempt to bend them to human will. But in most stories, it was the human who ended up bent, broken, or enslaved. These were the forbidden pacts, and the price they demanded was always higher than expected. The belief that jinn could be commanded or compelled goes back to ancient roots. Solomon's dominion over them, described in the Quran and elaborated in folklore, showed that such mastery was possible when granted by divine authority. But for ordinary people, without prophetic sanction, to attempt such control was an act of transgression. It was stepping into a realm of power not meant for human hands. Yet this did not stop seekers of hidden arts. Sorcerers, magicians, and those desperate for influence often turned to the jinn, convinced that they could bargain with the unseen and emerge stronger for it. In many traditions, the methods of summoning were elaborate and dangerous. Sorcerers fasted for days, drew circles of protection on the ground, and recited incantations at night. They used objects inscribed with mysterious symbols, burned strange herbs, and offered sacrifices of blood or incense. The rituals were said to open a doorway between the worlds, drawing the attention of the jinn. But attracting their attention was one thing, controlling them was another. Once present, the jinn were not eager servants. They demanded offerings, obedience, or loyalty in return. The sorcerer might think himself in command, but the balance of power was always uncertain. The most common price of such dealings was corruption. Sorcerers who sought the aid of the jinn were said to lose their purity, their faith, their very humanity. To bind a jinn meant to give up something essential in return, sometimes wealth, sometimes blood, sometimes even one's soul. Folktales warned that the more a magician relied on jinn, the more dependent he became, until he could no longer act without them. The pact that began with promises of mastery ended with enslavement, the human bound as tightly as the spirit he thought he controlled. Stories abound of men who sought to command an Ifrit for strength or a Marid for treasure, only to meet terrible ends. A sorcerer might summon a jinn to help him defeat his rivals, and for a time it would work. His enemies would fall ill, his fortunes would rise, his name would spread. But eventually the jinn would demand more, greater sacrifices, darker acts. The sorcerer, trapped by his own greed, would comply until he was despised by his people and abandoned by his faith. In the end, the jinn would often turn on him, mocking his weakness, leaving him broken and destitute. The lesson was clear. The price of such power was always ruin. The imagery of forbidden pacts was not confined to moral tales alone. In popular imagination, sorcerers who trafficked with jinn became figures of fear in their own right. People whispered of men who could see the unseen, who spoke with spirits in the night, who sent sickness or misfortune with a word. These figures were both sought after and shunned. Desperate people sometimes went to them for help, offering money or loyalty in exchange for their skills. But everyone knew the source of their power was dangerous, and that to rely on them was to entangle oneself in the same web of corruption. In Islamic tradition, sorcery of this kind was strongly condemned. The Quran itself speaks of people in Babylon learning magic that separated husbands and wives, taught by devils, not by God. It emphasizes that such knowledge brought no benefit, and that those who practiced it sold their souls for a wretched bargain. This teaching aligned perfectly with the folk memory of forbidden pacts. Whatever power they brought was temporary and destructive, a test that lured people into disbelief and ruin. To seek control over jinn through magic was not only foolish but sinful, a rejection of trust in God in favor of reliance on rebels. Despite this condemnation, belief in such pacts remained widespread. People explained misfortunes, strange illnesses, or sudden wealth by pointing to sorcery. They imagined that certain men and women, skilled in the hidden arts, had bound jinn to their service. Sometimes these individuals were feared as outcasts. Other times, they were courted by rulers who sought to use their abilities for political gain. In either case, the image of the sorcerer with his jinn remained powerful, a reminder that temptation to reach beyond human limits was never far away. Some stories inverted the usual pattern, describing humans who outwitted the jinn in their bargains. Clever sorcerers tricked the spirits into giving more than they received, binding them into service with clever words or sealed contracts. But even in these tales, the danger was emphasized. A jinn deceived once would bide its time, waiting for the chance to strike back. Its pride could not tolerate being bound by mortal hands forever. To imagine such bargains was to imagine a fragile balance, always at risk of collapse, where the human lived in constant fear of the vengeance of his unwilling servant. The theme of forbidden pacts also revealed a deeper truth about human nature. The desire to control the jinn reflected the desire to escape limitation, to seize power beyond one's station. The warnings that filled these tales were not only about spirits, but about the dangers of ambition without restraint. To seek forbidden pacts was to mirror the arrogance of Iblis himself, who refused to bow, who sought greatness apart from obedience. In this way, the stories carried moral weight. They were not only about sorcery, but about the dangers of pride, greed, and impatience. And yet, fascination with these pacts never faded. Even today, stories circulate of men who carry rings or amulets inscribed with names meant to bind spirits, of women who whisper prayers backwards in hopes of summoning aid, of treasures guarded by jinn that can only be claimed through bargains. The idea that power can be bought from the unseen continues to haunt imagination, even as tradition warns that the price is unbearable. The Forbidden Pact is a theme too compelling to disappear because it speaks to the universal temptation to reach for what lies beyond rightful grasp. The endurance of this idea also shaped cultural memory of sorcery. In many villages, accusations of magic still carry weight. A rival's sudden success, a family's unexplained misfortune, or a child's strange behavior might all be blamed on dealings with jinn. The sorcerer and his spirits remain figures of suspicion, feared for their power, but despised for their corruption. They stand as warnings, as living examples of what happens when humans step into forbidden realms. In the end, the stories of forbidden pacts reveal as much about people as they do about the jinn. They show how deeply the human desire for power runs, how tempting it is to reach beyond limits, and how easily ambition leads to ruin. The jinn in these tales are mirrors, reflecting human weakness, feeding on human greed, and waiting for the moment when the pact collapses. To make a bargain with them is to gamble with more than life. It is to gamble with the soul. And in such a wager, the jinn are always the winners. For all the grand tales of ifrits in flames, marids beneath the sea, or sorcerers bargaining with spirits, the memory of the jinn has always been most alive in the stories told about ordinary places. It was not only kings, poets, or magicians who encountered them. Farmers, shepherds, merchants, and travelers all carried stories of the hidden folk, woven into the daily fabric of life. These were not tales of distant times or faraway realms. They were warnings and recollections of houses where footsteps echoed when no one was home, of roads where travelers vanished, of voices calling in the night. The haunted house and the lonely road became the stage for countless encounters with the jinn, stories that reminded everyone that the unseen world was never far away. The haunted house was one of the most persistent images. An abandoned dwelling, left to crumble, was rarely thought of as empty. It was assumed that the jinn had moved in, making it their home once humans had departed. Anyone who entered such a place risked disturbing its new occupants. Sudden illness, fainting fits, or accidents that happened inside were explained as retaliation from the jinn, who resented the intrusion. Even in houses still inhabited, people believed that certain rooms or corners were claimed by unseen residents. Strange sounds at night, objects moved without explanation, or sudden chills were interpreted as signs that humans and jinn were sharing the same roof uneasily. There were customs meant to navigate this fragile coexistence. When moving into a new house, families often recited prayers, asking for blessing and protection from unseen presences. Some would sacrifice an animal at the threshold, spilling its blood to appease the spirits. In daily life, people were careful not to pour boiling water without first warning the unseen, lest they scald a jinn. Even in their own homes, they behaved with the awareness that they were never alone, that invisible neighbors were listening and watching. The haunted house was not merely a ruin at the edge of the village, but a reminder that every dwelling might carry more residents than could be counted. The lonely road was another place of fear. Travelers across the deserts knew well the dangers of bandits, thirst, and exhaustion. But alongside these natural threats was the constant suspicion that jinn haunted the paths, waiting for the careless. A traveller might hear his name called in the darkness and follow, only to lose his way. Lights flickering in the distance might lead him off the path until he collapsed in despair. The sudden appearance of a stranger offering guidance was never to be trusted, for the stranger could be a jinn in disguise, leading him to ruin. Stories of the lonely road often carried a pattern. A man set out alone at night, ignoring the advice to wait until morning or to travel with companions. Somewhere along the path, he heard or saw something strange. Footsteps when no one was near. The sound of laughter carried on the wind. A figure waiting by a tree. If he ignored it and kept walking, he might reach his destination unharmed. If he followed curiosity, if he answered the voice or approached the figure, he might never be seen again. These stories carried not only fear, but lessons. Do not wander alone. Do not yield to curiosity, and always show respect for the unseen world. The haunted house and lonely road also became part of explanations for tragedy. When someone went missing, when a family suffered a string of misfortunes, people whispered of jinn. A collapsed roof that killed its occupants was said to have been shaken by spirits. A man found dead on a road without signs of struggle was said to have been taken by them. These interpretations gave meaning to loss, situating it within the larger story of life lived alongside another creation. The jinn filled the silence left by unanswered questions, offering a way to speak of what could not otherwise be explained. Children were often the audience for these tales. Parents warned them not to wander off into ruins, not to linger on the roads after sunset, not to play near wells alone. The threat of the jinn was invoked as a discipline, teaching caution through fear. The stories were often told around fires, their details growing sharper with each retelling. In this way, the haunted house and the lonely road became not only images of danger, but tools for education, shaping how new generations approach the world. But these encounters were not always hostile. Some stories told of jinn who helped travelers, leading them to water or shelter in times of need. Others spoke of families who lived peacefully in houses long believed to be haunted, protected, rather than harmed by their unseen companions. The jinn, like humans, were said to vary in character, some malicious, others benign, still others indifferent. This variety added depth to the folklore. Not every haunted house was a place of terror. Not every lonely road ended in ruin. But one could never know which kind of jinn one would meet, and so caution was always required. The haunted house in particular held a strange fascination. People told of treasures buried under its floors, guarded by jinn who claimed them. Adventurers and thieves sometimes entered in search of wealth, only to flee in terror when confronted with apparitions or strange happenings. The belief that jinn guarded hidden riches gave abandoned buildings a double aura, both dangerous and tempting. To enter was to risk one's life, but also to risk being rewarded beyond measure. This tension kept such places alive in imagination, never truly forgotten even when left to crumble. In Islamic practice, belief in haunted places was tempered with remedies. People were taught to recite the name of God before entering unknown or abandoned spaces, to remind themselves and the spirits that human presence was guided by faith. Exorcisms and recitations of scripture were used to cleanse houses believed to be infested by jinn. These practices reinforced the idea that faith was stronger than fear, that even in the most haunted places, divine words carried protection. The lonely road likewise became associated with protective rituals. Travelers recited prayers before setting out, carried charms inscribed with verses, or sang aloud to ward off spirits. Companionship was the strongest safeguard, for the jinn were thought to prey on the solitary. Groups of travelers felt safer not only from human dangers, but from the unseen as well. The lonely road was less frightening when filled with conversation, with laughter, with the noise of life pushing back against the silence of the desert. The endurance of these stories speaks to their universality. Every culture has its haunted houses and lonely roads, places where fear gathers, where the imagination populates silence with unseen beings. In Arabia, those beings were the jinn. They were the footsteps in the empty hall, the figure by the roadside, the voice in the night. They were explanations, warnings, and companions to human fear. To speak of haunted houses and lonely roads was to speak of the places where human vulnerability was most exposed, where the line between the seen and unseen seemed to blur. And so these encounters remained alive, passed down through generations. They shaped behavior, instilled caution, and reminded people that the world was never empty. Every ruin, every road, every house carried more life than the eyes could see. The jinn were always near, sometimes silent, sometimes active, sometimes hostile, sometimes helpful. To live with them was to live with the knowledge that the unseen world shared every path, every wall, every shadow. The haunted house and the lonely road were not just places on a map. They were symbols of coexistence with beings who remained hidden but never absent. For centuries, stories of the jinn lived in poetry, folk tales, and whispered warnings around campfires. They belonged to deserts, ruins, lonely roads, and haunted wells, bound to the rhythms of a world where superstition and survival were deeply entangled. Yet even as societies changed, as empires rose and fell, as science replaced myth in explaining many mysteries, the jinn never vanished. Instead, they transformed, adapting to new landscapes, new technologies, and new imaginations. In the modern world, they stand at a strange crossroads. they remain rooted in superstition and lived belief in many parts of the world, while also becoming icons of popular culture, appearing in novels, films, video games, and even internet memes. The jinn have proven as enduring as the fears and fascinations that created them, still haunting daily life, but also thriving in the realm of entertainment. In villages and towns across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, belief in the jinn remains alive. People still speak of possessions, of curses, of sudden illnesses traced back to unseen forces. Families call upon religious healers to recite Quranic verses over those believed to be afflicted. Houses where misfortune lingers are said to be infested, prompting exorcisms and prayers to cleanse them. Even in urban centers, where modern medicine and psychology dominate, these beliefs persist in parallel. A doctor might diagnose depression, while a family member whispers that the Quran is whispering too strongly, or that an enemy has sent a jinn through sorcery. The coexistence of science and superstition reflects how deeply the jinn are woven into cultural consciousness. Modern fears often take older forms. People avoid whistling at night, believing it attracts the hidden folk. Travelers still murmur prayers when passing desolate places. Parents caution children not to play near wells or wander into ruins. These practices, centuries old, remain part of daily life. For many, the unseen world is not a relic of the past, but a present reality, as real as electricity or gravity. To live with the jinn is simply to acknowledge that the world is more than what can be measured, that the unseen shares space with the seen. At the same time, the jinn have entered the world of mass media and global culture. Stories once told orally in villages now appear in books, movies, and television. The 1001 Nights, with its tales of imprisoned marids and clever heroes, became one of the first bridges between Arabian folklore and the Western imagination. The image of the genie in a lamp spread far beyond its origins, reshaped into comical or benevolent forms for entertainment. Films like Aladdin presented the jinn as magical wish-granters, stripped of their menace, turned into companions rather than threats. This reinvention made them accessible to audiences unfamiliar with their darker history, creating a divide between the jinn of folklore and the genie of popular culture. Yet not all modern depictions are harmless. Horror films across the Middle East and beyond have drawn on the jinn's reputation as deceivers and possessors, presenting them as terrifying forces that invade human life. In these stories, the jinn appear much closer to their traditional forms, unseen presences that whisper, manipulate, or drive people to madness. The genre of supernatural horror thrives on what the jinn have always represented: the fear that danger lurks in the unseen, that evil can strike from the shadows without warning. These films remind audiences that behind the comic genie lies a much older and more frightening legacy. Video games and novels have also embraced the jinn. In fantasy settings, they appear as elemental beings, spirits of fire or water, allies or enemies to the player. They are given backstories, hierarchies, and personalities, expanding on their folkloric roots. In literature, authors use them to explore themes of freedom, temptation, and the boundaries between worlds. Western writers often treat them as exotic figures, symbols of a mysterious East, while Middle Eastern authors use them to wrestle with their own cultural inheritance. The jinn, once confined to oral tradition, have become global characters, adapted to every medium available. On the internet, stories of jinn encounters circulate widely, blending folklore with modern anxieties. Social media is filled with videos claiming to capture jinn on camera, strange shadows in empty buildings, or unexplained voices caught on recording devices. These clips gain millions of views, proving that fascination with the unseen has not faded in the age of smartphones. Online forums host discussions about experiences with jinn, blending old superstitions with new technologies. The haunted house becomes an abandoned apartment building. The lonely road becomes a deserted highway at night. The jinn migrate into modern spaces without losing their old associations. Even in psychology, the figure of the jinn has persisted. In communities where belief in them remains strong, patients describe their struggles in terms of possession or harassment. Therapists and doctors must often navigate between medical diagnoses and cultural interpretations, respecting the role that jinn beliefs play in how people understand their suffering. In this way, the jinn remain part of lived experience, not only as symbols, but as frameworks through which people interpret reality. The endurance of belief in the jinn in the modern world raises questions about the nature of superstition itself. Why do such beings continue to matter in an age of satellites and laboratories? Part of the answer lies in the universality of fear. The jinn embody the unseen dangers that science cannot erase, the unpredictability of life, the persistence of temptation, the fragility of human control. They speak to vulnerabilities that technology has not conquered. Loneliness, illness, sudden tragedy, and unexplained phenomena. In this sense, the jinn remain necessary, filling spaces that rational explanations cannot fully satisfy. At the same time, their transformation into figures of entertainment reflects the human ability to domesticate fear. By turning the jinn into comic companions, wish granters, or colourful antagonists, modern culture strips them of their terror and makes them manageable. They become safe, familiar, even lovable. This duality, fear and entertainment, mirrors their place in the past, where they were both warnings and subjects of storytelling around the fire. The modern world has not destroyed the jinn. It has simply given them new costumes. In Muslim communities around the world, the jinn continue to occupy a theological space as well. Preachers warn against seeking their aid, against falling for sorcery, against blaming them for every misfortune. At the same time, they acknowledge their reality, grounding belief in the words of Scripture. This balance allows believers to take the jinn seriously without falling into obsession. Faith remains the shield against their whispers, the same as it has always been. The presence of the jinn in sermons, religious education, and daily practices ensures that they remain part of the living tradition, not just relics of folklore. Perhaps what makes the jinn so enduring is their adaptability. They can haunt abandoned huts or modern apartment blocks. They can lure travelers off desert roads or unsettle drivers on empty highways. They can be terrifying monsters in horror films or comic sidekicks in children's cartoons. They can be invoked in whispers of sorcery or in the scripts of fantasy novels. Their essence, hidden, fiery, elusive, fits any context where the unseen still matters. In this way, they remain one of the most flexible and persistent creations of the human imagination. And so in the modern world, the jinn walk two paths. On one, they remain figures of superstition, feared in households, prayed against in mosques, invoked in daily life whenever misfortune strikes. On the other, they thrive in the global imagination, reshaped into characters for stories, symbols of magic and mystery. Both paths reinforce their power. They are never forgotten, never fully dismissed, never entirely tamed. They live in fear and in laughter, in prayer and in play, in whispered warnings and in glowing screens. The jinn endure, not as relics of the past, but as companions of the present, reminders that even in a world of science and technology, the unseen continues to matter. To follow the stories of the jinn from their beginnings in Arabian deserts, through centuries of faith, folklore, and imagination, is to uncover more than just the history of spirits. It is to uncover the mirror they hold up to humanity. The jinn have always been gatekeepers of the unseen, standing at the threshold between what can be touched and what must only be believed. They embody fears, desires, warnings, and temptations, and in doing so, they reveal as much about ourselves as they do about the hidden world. To speak of the jinn is not only to describe fiery beings that share the earth with us, it is to describe the human condition, framed through stories that endure because they speak to something timeless. The jinn reveal first our relationship with fear, in ruins and graveyards, in deserts and lonely roads. They appear as predators, deceivers, or whisperers. They remind us that human beings are never fully in control, that danger can strike from beyond our senses, that the world is larger and darker than we imagine. By embodying these fears in the figure of the jinn, people found a way to name what frightened them most. The ghoul is the terror of wilderness, the silat, the fear of deception, the Qaran, the unease of temptation within. Each figure gives shape to an anxiety that is deeply human, making it tangible, making it something to resist, avoid, or endure. In this way, the jinn preserve fear while also making it manageable. They allow us to tell stories that keep terror close but under control, transforming raw dread into narrative that can be shared. The jinn also reveal our relationship with desire. Tales of forbidden pacts show how far people are willing to go to seize power or wealth, even at the risk of ruin. Stories of silat highlight the dangers of unchecked attraction, where beauty becomes a mask for destruction. Legends of Marids guarding treasures beneath the sea reflect the human longing for abundance, coupled with the suspicion that such riches always come at a price. The jinn personify the temptations that humans wrestle with daily, magnifying them into spirits that make clear the cost of surrender. They are not only enemies, but warnings, teaching through their very existence that desire without restraint leads to destruction. At the same time, the jinn reveal our relationship with faith. The Quran's insistence that they too were created by God, that they too are accountable, place them firmly within the moral order of the universe. They remind believers that temptation is real, but never irresistible, that whispers exist but cannot compel, that unseen forces are strong but never beyond divine authority. The jinn thus serve as reminders of faith's protective power, illustrating in story what theology declares in principle, that trust in God is stronger than any unseen threat. The daily practices of prayer, remembrance, and recitation become shields not only against despair, but against the whispers of the jinn themselves. But perhaps most profoundly, the jinn reveal our relationship with ourselves. The idea of the Qaran, the companion who whispers constantly, is nothing less than a recognition of the inner voice of temptation. It externalizes what we all know to be true, that we struggle not only with external dangers, but with the desires and weaknesses that rise within. To describe them as jinn is to give form to that inner struggle, to make it part of a cosmic story rather than an isolated personal failure. In this way, the jinn provide not only explanation, but dignity. They remind us that our struggles are shared, that temptation is part of the human condition, and that resisting it is part of what gives life meaning. The endurance of jinn stories across centuries also reveals our need for mystery. Even in a world mapped by satellites and explained by science, the unseen remains irresistible. The haunted house, the lonely road, the abandoned building, all still draw stories of hidden presences. The modern world has changed the settings, but not the need. We still imagine shadows that move when no one is there, voices that call when we are alone, presences that lurk just beyond sight. The jinn survive because they speak to this need, to the hunger for mystery, to the recognition that not everything can or should be explained. They are the guardians of wonder as much as of fear, keeping alive the sense that the world is larger than our senses allow. In popular culture, the jinn reveal our capacity to reshape fear into entertainment. The terrifying ifrit of old stories becomes the comical genie of cartoons. The Marid becomes a character in a fantasy game. The Silat becomes the antagonist of a modern horror film. These transformations do not erase the old meanings, but coexist with them, showing how stories adapt to different needs. We tame what terrifies us by making it laughable, approachable, or fictional. Yet the persistence of darker depictions in horror films or whispered folktales shows that the old fear remains alive. The jinn exist in both registers at once, feared in belief, enjoyed in fiction. They reveal how we manage our deepest anxieties by shifting them between terror and play. The jinn also reveal our relationship with power. Human beings have always sought control over what lies beyond them, whether through prayer, ritual, or sorcery. The jinn became the canvas onto which this desire was projected, to command them, to summon them, to bind them into service. These were fantasies of ultimate mastery, of breaking the boundaries of human limitation. The warnings that accompany such tales remind us that this desire is dangerous, that power seized unlawfully always corrupts. The stories of sorcerers destroyed by their own jinn are parables of ambition, teaching that control of the unseen is not only impossible, but destructive. The jinn reveal not only our hunger for power, but the dangers of forgetting our place in the order of creation. In their diversity, the jinn reveal the richness of human imagination. There are tricksters and predators, teachers and deceivers, giants of the sea and whisperers of the heart. Each type embodies a different facet of experience, a different anxiety, temptation, or mystery. Together they form a map of the human soul, charting the fears, desires, and struggles that define life. They are not random inventions, but structured reflections, shaped by the landscapes of Arabia, the teachings of Islam, and the universal questions of existence. In this sense, the jinn are as much human creations as they are independent beings, mirrors through which we tell stories about ourselves. And so, to unmask the jinn is to unmask humanity. The fire-born spirits, hidden yet ever present, reveal the boundaries of our fear, the reach of our desire, the strength of our faith, and the depth of our imagination. They are gatekeepers of the unseen, not because they control it, but because they embody the way we approach it. Through them, we confront what cannot be seen. We give form to what cannot be touched. We wrestle with what cannot be escaped. They are our neighbors in the shadows, our adversaries in temptation, our mirrors in pride and weakness. They endure because the truths they reflect endure. The jinn remind us that to be human is to live between worlds, the world of the visible and the world of the unseen, the certainty of what we can measure and the mystery of what we cannot. They remind us that fear, temptation, and wonder are not flaws, but parts of our condition. They remind us that the unseen is never far away, and that in struggling with it, we learn who we are.